Matt Jarvis. I am the chair of the Division of Politics, Administration, and Justice. I am pleased to welcome Cal State Fullerton's president, Fram Vergy, to the podium. Since 2018, he has elevated the profile and reputation of Cal State Fullerton, and we are thankful for his commitment to a variety of campus programs, including the Royce International Symposium. President Vergy.
Boy, that's the fastest quieting I've ever seen of this group. I don't know how you did that, Matt. That's pretty good. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for that introduction, and I love being here interacting with Titan alums, especially Titan alums that have literally transformed the world. And that's what we have, Ed. You exemplify that in so many ways. You are the definition of a world changer. Here we are just sitting talking, and we're talking about Africa, and then I turn and we're talking about Ukraine, and all the things we're going to be having the panels talk about. It is exactly what you are the essence of for not just for Cal State Fullerton, but for the country and for the world. I'm so proud of our continuing partnership with you, and Cal State Fullerton loves being on this journey with you. Folks, you know this. Ed Royce is a remarkable person. He's a member of our 325,000 alumni at Cal State Fullerton. His accomplishments have enabled us all to be better connected as a Titan family, nationally and globally. And so when we say it takes a Titan, and we say that often, Ed Royce is exactly the kind of Titan it takes. Well, I'm sure much has changed since Ed was at Cal State Fullerton when it was a sleepy commuter school in equally sleepy Orange County. I'm also quite sure that a few of the core principles have remained true. For the last 6 decades, Cal State Fullerton it has continued to demonstrate a Titan-sized commitment to graduating engaged and informed citizens. Engaged and informed citizens who then can make a difference in their local community, in the state, in the nation, and in the world. And as the largest campus in the CSU system and the only one in Orange County, we know that we have a responsibility to the community and to the region. We want our graduates to use the foundational education that they gain at Cal State Fullerton to engage their pursuits and their passions that we also provide to them, and then go out and change the world, make the world a better place. We're also committed to ensuring that all these education pathways are available for all who aspire to that college degree, for all who aspire to not only raise themselves up, but raise their families up and raise up their communities. And if it is through that lens through which we seek to travel this journey, then I believe that we are on our way at Cal State Fullerton. Today, Cal State Fullerton is the home to 41,000 students. In fact, we're the largest undergraduate university in California. Orange County has the largest undergraduate university in California. And we were most recently recognized, yeah, absolutely. And we were most recently recognized as the 3rd largest master's university in the nation. Now, bigger doesn't always mean better, but in this case, bigger means best. In each of the past few years, we've received 80,000 applications for about 8,000 spots. It is a rigorous institution. We're consistently nationally ranked for both academic rigor and lowest net cost. Lowest net cost, 50% of our students graduate with no debt. And for the other half, for the half that have debt, that debt is about $15,000. Folks, that is thank you to the state of California more than anybody else that has a commitment to higher education. We are a transformative institution. More than 57% of our graduates are underrepresented students. They come from underserved communities. We're #1 in California for graduating women. We're #3 in the nation for graduating students of color. Nearly 60% of our students are first generation, first in their family ever to attend college. So we are a catalyst for change. Nearly half of our students are Pell-eligible students, and about half of our teachers and nurses and accountants and engineers in Orange County, they come from Cal State Fullerton. We produce them every year. We're a Hispanic-serving institution and an Asian, Native American Pacific Islander serving institution. And we are very, very proud of those designations. Some universities consider them just as a badge and something to check off. But we are absolutely determined to serve those students, to make sure that those designations mean something. That's why we were only one of 4 universities last year in the same week to be named as an inaugural Fulbright Hispanic-serving institution by the U.S. State Department and to receive the Seal of Excellencia from Excellencia in Education for serving Latinx students. Each year, you can clap all you want. I'll always take that. Each year we graduate about 12,000 students. And this is an incredible statistic. We have 325,000 alums, and 80% of them live within 50 miles of our campus. So we are Orange County. We own Orange County. It is better in Orange County, sorry guys, to be a Titan than a Trojan or a Bruin or an Anteater or anything else as far as I'm concerned. And we continue to drive the Orange County economy as well. For every dollar that we get from the state, we put about $13.50 back into the economy. And with alums like Ed, our reach extends beyond just Orange County or the state. It extends to the nation and internationally. And that's why I'm so very excited to be a part of the second, I love that we can say that already, the second Royce International Symposium. The goal of this symposium is to advance academic research and campus-based community engagement on issues of international significance. At Cal State Fullerton, we have a very strong commitment to be a place where our students, our faculty, our staff, and our community can be prepared to engage in the world as global citizens. We have a long history in the Titan family of creating international agreements with more than 100 global institutions of higher learning from all over the world. We have those students coming to us, and we are sending our students out to them. We have our faculty going out to teach there, and their faculty coming to teach us. And that is only expanding with post-pandemic hybrid classes and online education. We're looking at that more and more every day. Exposure to international academic programs through a study abroad program, working and living and studying with students from across the world, it creates the environment that will build the global community that we want to build. We offer our students and our faculty and our staff a rare opportunity to interact in this world as it expands. So with our campus objective of embracing education through diversity and an inclusive world, we have grad students that are global citizens, and we're thrilled to be part of this event. So to the students that were here, and I know we had a couple of students stand up, I'm so proud that you were here. Thank you for being here. Just listen. You are going to get so much out of this event. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you. You will not regret it. I promise you that. To the rest of our guests, thank you as well for being here too. Thank you to the Nixon Library, of course, a great partner with Cal State Fullerton for sponsoring the event today. And then, of course, to our keynote speaker, to Ed. Thank you for your continuing partnership with your alma mater. You make us so proud that you are part of the Titan family. You are a Titan among Titans. That's exactly who you are. And so it's my honor to introduce and invite one of the most distinguished alumnus that we have to the podium to provide commentary and an overall trip around the world of what's going on in American foreign policy in this destabilized world that we have. We're going to have a great panel after, but for now, please welcome me in welcoming Ed Royce.
President Vergy, thank you for those kind words. Thank you for your leadership at the university. And I have to also thank Cal State Fullerton for joining today in helping put together this symposium. It's got a great theme, American foreign policy in a destabilized world. I want to thank the World Affairs Council also for your role in this, and of course, the Nixon Library. Orange County Forum is represented here. Thank you. And what I'd like to do is give an overview, and I think I've got to start with a Nixon story because of where we are. So I'll do that, and then maybe get to questions and answers with you. But to start with some of Nixon's observations, I was elected in '92, so I remember. Oh, before I do that, it's St. Patrick's Day. And I have to introduce somebody here because we met on St. Patrick's Day. That's my wife, Marie, who also happens to be the former Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs. So thank you for being here with us today. The observation I make, when I got to D.C., one of the first things we did in '93, Richard Nixon wanted to address the House of Representatives. Now, this would be his last address to the Congress. But when it was over, he noticed me and he said, Royce, you've got my old district. And he started, he already knew I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, which surprised me. And so what he said was, I have an opportunity to talk to the Senate, and I would like you to come along and hear my observations. And then he went back to pressing me on how you have to be engaged on foreign affairs to really know what's going on in the world. So in those remarks, what was notable to me was this is the first time I had seen Nixon sort of go around the world, but he had started with China. Opening up to China was his legacy. But the interesting part of his presentation was that second thoughts were already starting to form. And this was his point. He said, you know, I think Russia is destined to always be dysfunctional. But he said, Beijing, on the other hand, you know, there's a great opportunity here. Like Europe, like Japan, we may change them by opening up. The democratic ideals, you know, and rights that we think that they will adopt could make a huge impact on the future for stability. But on the other hand, the subservience to authority in a society which has a long history of authoritarian systems, if you were to combine that with state capitalism, this could be a real challenge. It could be a real challenge because of the power that China would have. We have to be engaged, I remember him saying. We have to try to have this impact. But his point was the jury is out in terms of how this will develop. And I think back to the lessons that Richard Nixon probably learned back when he was in law school. Over here in La Habra was his office, his law office. And in 1939, he would have been in that office representing this area. Not yet representing this area, but working in this area. And reading the paper. And I'll show you the map that he would have seen at that time if this comes up. This would be the pacts or agreements which at the time were being made between Hitler and Stalin, as well as the tripartite pact with Japan and the Pact of Steel with Italy. And each of these agreements, just to explain what was happening that year. In September of that year, the agreement between Hitler and Stalin was to have Stalin invade Finland, take the eastern half of Poland, take the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, take eastern Romania, have Hitler take Western Europe, and have all of Southern Europe, the Mediterranean area, that was to go to Mussolini, who, under the Pact of Steel, took over Albania attacked Greece, was in the process of taking the islands in the Mediterranean. In Africa, in East Africa, defeated Ethiopia and Somalia. North Africa took Libya. They had this mapped out. And of course, in Japan, all of East Asia, all the island chain, ultimately, it doesn't show in that map, but ultimately, the coast of Australia was attacked over 100 times by bombers, the cities all along the north, as the ships were being sunk in the east. This was the world which, on September 1st, 1939, suddenly confronted the world. And there was a decision to be made by policymakers in Washington. And that decision was, watching what had was unfolding with 4 totalitarian powers, would we send aid, munitions, to Britain? Because the United Kingdom was standing alone at that time. The decision was made by President Roosevelt, as well as, by a majority of the Senate, to, through Lend-Lease, send 50 of our U.S. destroyers to replace those who had been sunk by German U-boats. The purpose was to keep the food and fuel coming into Britain so that Britain could continue the fight. And the decision was made to transfer fighter planes in order to intercept the bombers that were nightly flying over London during the Blitz. And this was effective in keeping these sea lanes open. What was not known by the United States was that at that time, von Ribbentrop, who had done these very agreements with Molotov and of course with El Duce, with Mussolini, he was at that time carrying out negotiations with the Japanese, urging them to attack the United States and be part of expanding this pact. And Tojo jumped the gun. He jumped the gun on December 7th. And before Hitler had consolidated his gains, because Hitler had 6 months prior, decided to renege on his agreement with Stalin and to try to seize Moscow and Leningrad quickly. That did not happen. I'm just going through what was learned through all of this, or should be learned by policymakers. That did not happen because of the winter, the severity of the Russian winter, and because of General Zhukov and his troops. They stopped them. But in Pearl Harbor, we lost our fleet, and Hitler had not consolidated his gains. He declared war on us before we did on him. But as a consequence of this, it brought the United States into the war. The reason I walk through this is because for the presidents that lived through this war as young men, such as Nixon and John F. Kennedy, they had an opportunity to observe lifelong lessons of what happens when authoritarian, or in this case, totalitarian governments that are militantly so, are on the march and begin to carve up territory and do not have any respect for the democratic states that they are rolling over, because that was the early discussion. Let's take out the democracies. What they also learned was that the United States, when they saw a free people willing to fight back, might be wise to transfer those armaments or those destroyers, because as the number of allies of free states are diminished, as the number of democracies are eclipsed and replaced, by authoritarian control, the security of our own people are eventually at risk. The cost also, 50 million souls died in that war. 6 million Jews among them, millions of other innocents that were slaughtered, and then whole armies that were ground up across North Africa and Europe and Asia. Let me go to the next map that I'd like to just focus on. Not long ago, an agreement was made, an alliance without limits between Russia and China. And again, my concern here is what is transpiring in the rhetoric coming out of Beijing and the actions of what they've done in the South China Sea. The fact that the atolls and right up to basically the borders of their neighbors in the first island chain. China is militarizing those islands and expanding them, building air bases, all with offensive weaponry. Their rhetoric and actions against the Japanese, against the Philippines, against the Indonesians, especially against the Taiwanese. These are issues that normally states that want good relations with their neighbors do not engage in. But this has been very aggressive behavior. And some 9 days after this agreement was signed, Putin, of course, attacked again, in this case, trying to take Kyiv, trying to take all of Ukraine. And 20 days after that agreement, after that press conference, you had the rhetoric about attacks on Taiwan by President Xi, or I should say his actual title is, he's the chief of the Communist Party. It's not a presidential position. It's a Leninist system in which he's appointed to that by the Politburo, or in this case, he's basically appointed himself. He's consolidated all power. At moments like this, it behooves us to look at history and to think and maybe rethink what we should be doing in order to deepen our ties with our allies and create a credible deterrence. In the case of Taiwan, we should be transferring them every missile system. We should make a porcupine, as someone once said, out of that island. They should have the capability of launching a credible defense so that China is not tempted to do the unthinkable. And likewise, we should, in my opinion, if a free people in Ukraine are looking for ammunition, we should be sending it. I will share with you that the concerns the Ukrainians had are the same concerns that 6 nations in former Central Asia have. When I had conversations with the current chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, he said his worry, and this goes back to the collapse of Afghanistan, but at the time he said, my worry is that the way in which we pulled out of Afghanistan, and he reminded me, President Trump wanted to pull out, and now President Biden is pulling out. The way we're doing that, we are going to be perceived as betraying the women of Afghanistan, but also our allies and partners who have suggested that France and Britain stay in Bagram and stay in the major cities because the Afghans are doing the fighting. Why pull out now? All of that will be called into question. I would suggest that at this point in time, when Europe is sending ammunition and armaments, we would want to do that as well. I would also make the strong point that we never want to see U.S. troops in Ukraine. At the same time, we also have to be prudent about the weapons that are sent. We do not intend to send weapons that can reach the Kremlin, that can reach Moscow. But we should send those defensive weapons that will serve to defend a free people in Ukraine. And I'll share with you, in 2014, I took a delegation of 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats. We went as far east as we could go. We went into Dnipropetrovsk, which were Russian-speaking Ukrainians, with the presumption that there would be more than one opinion when we got there. What I can share with you is that in our discussions, these Russian-speaking Ukrainians were filling sandbags as fast as they could fill them, and they were asking us to send anti-tank weapons and, artillery and so forth, and something that they could use, anti-aircraft weaponry. And even the one fellow I was able to find who represented the other side whispered to me when the delegation went out meeting, at the end of the day, we've got to figure out how we get the Russians out of here. That was a surprise to me. We passed my bill in 2014 to authorize then President Obama to use that authority. That was not used then, that was not used under the Trump administration, that was not used under the Biden administration until basically right after the attack. I do think, again, that this issue of putting forward credible deterrence is important. We can get into this in questions and answers. I wanted to make a few more points here very quickly. One is historically, this is the Han Empire. This would be, you'll see the Roman Empire to the west. This is sort of the high watermark for China at the time. But for the Han people, there is a narrative. They have their narrative in terms of how they see history. And as you can see, the expanse of China with its many tributary states over the years who recognized the leadership of sovereignty and paid tribute, it is a long list of countries. This is, again, from the perspective of the narrative which the Chinese people study. This is the trip taken by Admiral Zheng He's fleet, his 4th voyage, but you get a sense of Chinese power because this was a fleet of 300 ships. You can see they were 400 feet long. The 3 ships in Columbus's navy, or in his squadron, I should say, the biggest was 85 feet long. And that transported a force to the New World of, what does it say up there? How many men on those ships? 90 sailors. That's to be contrasted with 28,000 sailors. And, this is both trips in the 1400s. It gives you a sense of that perspective that the Chinese have about their history and dominance over the region. Now we go to the Belt and Road today. And here you can see both the Belt and the road. You can see all of the ports, 50 of them, that China has built or is building. In dark blue are the ports, and the light blue are the ones they're building. You see in Australia what has become a real issue. China's built 3 ports there. And that's a domestic issue now because of the concerns of the belligerent way in which China's behaving, and they're not going to get the ports back for another 90 years. I'd like to go to another point, maybe my final point before we go to questions and answers. And that is, I made many trips as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, but one of them was to Africa with Secretary Colin Powell. And his great concern during that trip was what was happening, what he was being told by leaders in China, and the leaders in Africa who were telling him what Chinese ministers were telling them. And he said the pitch was as follows. It was, in China we have a much better system. And our system, all the power It's concentrated. And we think in your country it should be you. And we do not think you should have another election here. We would like to have our security people help you. In exchange, there are a few prerequisites that we think you really ought to implement. One of those is freedom of the press needs to go. We have our Chinese television that we'll bring in here, and we'll do that, in English or French or whatever. But freedom of the press, you don't need that. You also, in terms of the court system, do away with the independent courts. You do not want to have that system. And lastly, we'd like to sole source your raw materials over to China. Now, in many cases, this meant taking apart the processing or smeltering plants or whatever that were done in Africa and moving that to China. Well, that meant that, the value added would be in China instead, and certainly the employment would be in China. This is another point that Powell made to me. You have hundreds of thousands of Chinese who are being brought over as laborers instead of integrating their workforce in these projects. And on top of it, the main challenge is that they're attaching these assets with usurious interest rates. This is loan sharking. So our Secretary of State was focused on an issue which we have now learned a lot about since. But in learning about this, we have to deploy an effective competition to it. We now have the Development Finance Corporation, the International Development Finance Corporation, which we passed out of committee, which allows us to underwrite and compete directly with the money that comes from Beijing. But we have to be attentive to this. We have the ability. We're now introducing 5G across Africa to compete directly with Huawei. But one of the great advantages is that people trust the 5G system. I don't need to belabor these points. I think a lot of you are aware of the challenges ahead. But I think the next generation needs to think long and hard about the lessons that John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon learned during that generation. And I think we should not necessarily assume then that when nations behave belligerently, I see Tom Sheehy here. One of the things he told me once was how a nation treats its own people can tell you a lot about how it is likely to treat its neighbors. And one last takeaway. From Pericles to Abraham Lincoln, there was a theme from democratic Athens on through into this country. Pericles' speech to the Athenians, Lincoln borrowed from that for basically the outline for his Gettysburg Address. The idea of the autonomy of a free people, the ideal of making everyone free. This has been a long, slow, clumsy, embarrassing climb for humanity, given the doctrine. But at least we have pushed that doctrine and we hold it up as our goal and we try to repair to it. And to know that through history, there are those who are authoritarian-minded, who have the opposite doctrine, one of dictatorship, one of the fatal conceit that a Joe Stalin or an Adolf Hitler can know better than everybody in their society and has the right to make every decision for the men and women in that society. I would suggest the last point I'd make here, we can learn a chapter from Ronald Reagan's playbook. We need to get back to radio-free Asia, radio-free liberty, radio-free Europe, and we need to broadcast across the world, including in Africa and South America, and give civil society a platform and give fair reporting a platform to tell people what's actually happening. Because if we don't do this, the disinformation is going to continue to compound. With that, do I have time to open up for some questions, Owen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Phil Donahue, so. Who's got a question? Okay, just a second. I'm going to get my exercise today. I ate the dessert, so. No, I get to hold it.
Ed, great to see you. Question I have, you didn't mention North Korea and what's evolved with North Korea and how you see that playing into what you just discussed.
I just didn't mention it because they haven't made any formal agreements. I mean, they send artillery and sell it to Africa, excuse me, they sell it obviously to Russia to be used, but as weaponry, but they're not in the same category as Iran, which is actually now building factories in Russia to make these suicide drones and have transferred all these suicide drones. The agreements that Iran is making with China and with Russia really make them a junior partner, maybe in the sense that Mussolini was a junior partner. And so I put them in that category. The North Koreans still aren't bound by any treaty. And so that's why I didn't really cover them. But you're right, they're also a tremendous challenge. Yes, gentlemen.
I've got a question over here, just a second.
Yes.
Hi, Ed. You know, you show on the prior slide
Yeah.
the areas that China is currently already operating ports.
Right.
But I'm glad that you put this one for two reasons. One,
right.
As of January 1st of 2023, China combined, with the Asian countries and became a new organization. And now they are the main, this organization is the main exporter now to China, not to the United States anymore. And then China is also constructing all kinds of ports in Latin America.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
What is the reason that we as a country are allowing all of this to happen, including all 90% of the countries from Mexico to Argentina are going socialist now? Why are we allowing that?
Well, because they're voting that way. This is the problem. And I addressed the parliament, the new parliament in Colombia, when they, made the decision. I mean, the people of Colombia elected the former head of one of the terrorist organizations that had blown up their Supreme Court there and killed a number of their judges. For many years, Colombia, was solidly a democratically governed country. The new incoming president obviously wants to change that constitution. I got an invitation to go down and speak last year to their parliament, and I laid out for them the obvious, as well as an anti-corruption message, because unfortunately, many of these countries, as they head out in this direction, it's Chinese corruption that makes this a lot easier. They play by a different set of rules. We in Europe enforce rules that do not allow this kind of corruption, including bribing government officials. But you know something about what's happened in Argentina with the former president. She's now vice president again, right? I mean, these things are inexplicable that people with that kind of a record would get back into office. But ultimately, these are decisions that have to be made, and the Chinese are operating television stations and messaging on a constant basis. What I'm saying is we have to get back to what Reagan did well, and we have to use the tools now that we've given policymakers and industry to use, frankly, the International, Development Finance Corporation, and get out there and compete, because that puts it on an even playing field, and we're trying to do that.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Oh, thank you, Owen. Thank you, Ed. Richard Downey from the World Affairs Council, and wonderful presentation. And let me first say, your analogy of the past and the reasons for why we should support Ukraine today are very effective. So thank you very much for that. My question is actually along the same lines with China. And as you mentioned, China is now increasing its trade throughout the world. Many of the countries in our own region, the largest trading partner is China. And in many cases, it's not because they really want to have trade with China, but because it's so attractive for a couple of the reasons you've mentioned. Brazil, for example, under President Bolsonaro, didn't want to have that, but they still, just because of the attractiveness, that is now the largest trading partner. China is. So those tools that you mentioned, most of what we have done now to kind of counteract that effect is basically just to warn countries that you really don't want to be in this integrated relationship with China, because it's a warning as opposed to doing something effective. What are those tools that we could do, make things more attractive to these countries who really don't want to work with China but want to work with us, but to make it very pragmatic for them to work with us?
It's a list of things that, frankly, are going to take. There's a new law that was passed by Mike McCall, who's now chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, but he has a provision that now directs our foreign service to basically be a commercial service. Everybody becomes a commercial service officer. Every single person in that embassy begins to do this. That is one step. The second step is, although we've vastly expanded the capabilities with the DFC, there's an equity fix that would allow us to do more and expand it more. The next point is that we have to put leverage on our allies. We are seeing this now in terms of their opposition on Huawei, of rip out and replace, right? You see Europe doing that. I see it right now in Africa in terms of the competition now against Huawei. The next thing you're going to see is, especially with the result of Michael Gallagher chairing, this select committee on China, you're seeing prescriptions come out of that committee and out of McCall's committee. We're not going to do dual-use investment into China, and we're going to begin to enforce the rules of the road. And I would suggest we need to enforce the same rules. Don't let China play by one set of rules and we play by another. It needs to be the same set of rules. And that's the bottom line. And I think you're going to see a lot of legislation come out of the House of Representatives and into the Senate to force these points.
Ed, we've got time for two more questions, one here and one over there, and then we got to get to the panel. So,
yes.
Here.
Hello, Mr. Royce. My name is Lavanya. I'm a student at Fullerton, and my question was that you, as a person who recognizes international relations and patterns, do you think that we, as a sovereign state, are entering an age of decolonization or colonization overall? Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think that the goal should be decolonization. The practical implication of both the attack directly, that we see against Ukraine, as well as what we see in Africa, leads me to believe that we're looking at an unfolding colonization. And I referenced Secretary Powell's concerns about what he had seen, in terms of bringing in workers without employing the locals. And I just think it very much looks like the European colonization of Africa in terms of not playing by a set of rules at all, and certainly not respecting the local rules or wishes of the local population. To cut a deal with a head of state is different than having the buy-in of people. That's why democracy is the best antidote to this, so that people can have their voices heard in protest about conditions like this. Another last question.
Final question here.
Sir, Tom Rendell, I'm an independent military analyst, but General MacArthur, reported by President Kennedy, actually told him anyone who would engage in a land war in Asia ought to have their head examined. but that would mean to wish to engage. We are actually practicing those things now, and we are not ahead in the game, but we have a long way to go.
Now, wait a minute. Where are we engaged by MacArthur's definition in a land war in Asia?
We are not, but we are engaged in a process that could lead to that. So what I'm saying is the military is preparing for the eventuality, because if you don't prepare, going back to what exists from ancient Roman times, if you want to avoid war, or if you want peace, prepare for war. But my main point would be, what would you think about reestablishing the U.S. Information Agency? Because much of what we need to do is public diplomacy related.
I think it's an A+ suggestion, because it would be done correctly. And I just would add this. Remember, you cannot do any of this without allies, nor should you. So the point is that when Japan is talking to India, and India is talking to Australia, and South Korea is paying attention, and the Philippines is talking again to the United States, and all of them are saying, we don't want to be aggressive, but we want a defensive relationship to make certain that we are able to keep the peace. I think a land war in Asia is not what we want, but a credible deterrence in Asia where we have our allies stationed there and we are transferring to them the weaponry is the first order of business right now in terms of that credible deterrence. Thank you, sir.
Ed, we've got one last
sure.
question, okay? And it's supposed to be short.
Okay. I don't know. As long as it's not about Afghanistan. I am kidding you, Hassan Nuri. Go ahead. Ask the question. I'm sorry.
You mentioned all the good things about Ronald Reagan.
Yeah? Yeah.
Yes. It was unyielding policies of Ronald Reagan, supported by young, brilliant people like you, that broke the back of the system of communism and disintegrated the Soviet Union. My proposal to you is to become a candidate for the presidency of the United States.
I wish you would have asked about Afghanistan. My Sherman-esque statement is, Hassan, even if you run my campaign and I was elected, I would not serve. I just want to be Sherman-esque about this.
You heard it here first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much for your engagement here.
So to begin, Paul and Tom, could you briefly describe your background, your area of expertise, and what are your interests in U.S. foreign policy regarding Europe? Go ahead.
Sure. No. Is this working? Okay. No, great. Thank you, David. Tom Sheehy, I have been privileged to be associated with Ed Royce for 23 years on the committee. So I served on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, and Ed Royce was chairman of several different subcommittees, and I was the staff director. So when I first arrived in Congress and working for him, he became chairman of the Africa subcommittee, and we did that work for 8 years and did a lot of good bipartisan work. And then he took over a subcommittee called Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade, and he chaired that for 8 years, and so I was the staff director and covered a lot of interesting issues. And then he became full committee chairman for 6 years, and so my job was running the committee. I'm not sure I see Amy in the room quite yet, but the two of us were in charge of Washington operations, myself on the committee, and we had a pretty good run of 6 years. We worked in a very bipartisan way. We passed over 80 bills into law signed by the president dealing with a full range of issues from Africa trade to promoting women in development, conservation, energy, the BUILD Act, which the chairman mentioned, to increase the size of the Development Finance Corporation. And so I left Congress 4 years ago when he retired. I'm now a part-time fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is a nonpartisan U.S. government-supported institution that does research and also does programs for the State Department and USAID. I'm focused on Africa, particularly China and Africa. I also have a consulting company and do work with a lot of businesses that are trying to compete against China in Africa, for example, and work with a couple other nonprofit organizations. So stay very involved in foreign policy.
All right, thanks. So I'm Paul Danieri. I'm from UC Riverside. I'm a political scientist. Thanks for the invitation. I very much appreciate being here. I've been studying Russia-Ukrainian relations for, I'm afraid to say, just over 30 years now. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, I had just finished a PhD dissertation, and I was looking around for a new research topic since mine had ceased to exist. And I thought, what's going to happen between these two big countries that are coming out of the Soviet Union, Russia and Ukraine? And so I started studying it. The long drawn-out result of that, among other things, has been a book called Ukraine and Russia, From Civilized Divorce, Uncivil War, the updated edition through August of 2022, of which is due out next week from Cambridge University Press. So there's my plug. I lived in Ukraine for a year back in the early 90s, have been back more times than I can count since. Spent some time in Russia, spent some time at NATO headquarters and EU headquarters in Brussels, but always with this focus on Russia and Ukraine and what that means more broadly for European security and for the United States. I should say I've taught now I've been at Riverside since 2014. Before that, I was at the University of Florida. And before that, I was for a long time at the University of Kansas. And especially at Kansas, I did a lot of work with the U.S. Army up at Fort Leavenworth, largely with the Command and General Staff College, but also with the School of Advanced Military Studies, the Foreign Military Studies Office, and some other things. And I do a bunch of stuff. We were just talking about best ways to get back and forth to Washington. I do a bunch of stuff with the government in Washington as well. So my interests in U.S. foreign policy in Europe have focused very much on U.S. policy towards Ukraine and Russia, and on how Europe and the United States, the North American community, deals with the challenges that come from that relationship.
All right. So the first question I have and you can both weigh in at any point. How would you characterize the state of European geopolitics regarding the Russian war in Ukraine? What's the significance of the war for Europe and for the wider world? And what are Putin's objectives, and what sort of implications do they have for European security?
All right. Go ahead, David.
Sure.
Sorry, that's not David.
Quite a roaming question, but I'm going to start. I mentioned just our congressional career, and so when we first took over this, or got involved in some of the activities on the committee, it was right after 9/11, and that very much caught everyone by shock, surprise. I remember being up in Congress, running around. Members of Congress were asking, "Who's Osama bin Laden?" It really came out of the dark, and so that defined our foreign policy for really up until Ed Royce left Congress. The idea of trying to work in ungoverned spaces to challenge the terrorist threat, whether it be Afghanistan, Iraq, or so forth. Obviously, that's changed a great deal now. And while I think those threats still very much exist, and I see Hassan Nouri in Afghanistan, I have to acknowledge that. While I think those terrorist threats still very much exist, as Ed Royce suggested, we're very much now into an area of great power competition. And we're seeing this play out with Ukraine, and as he mentioned, the relationship between China and Russia and Iran, with Iran being a major backer of the Russian invasion, supplying drones, and North Korea with artillery. And so, unfortunately, it's moving into an era where the U.S. and our Western allies are now confronting very aggressive states, and the challenges are almost daunting, frankly. I mean, everyone, we're focused and we're discussing here Ukraine, but we have a challenge with China, we have Taiwan, we have North Korea, we have Iran, and so that's the big geopolitical picture. I would add, I'm sitting next to two academics, so I'm going to mention it. In my own grad school career, I did my thesis on the balance of power, and you probably know Hans Morgenthau, who was a great theoretician. He was a German emigre, refugee out of World War II, escaped with his life from the Holocaust, and he was very much steeped in the European, looking at countries as monarchies and how they have unfortunately fought many wars over the centuries, and viewed balancing of power is important. You look at a country's national power, what the size of the military, the economy, what alliances it would create in order to maintain stability. Well, we have a balance of power now going on. We have very powerful states, but I would just, the big criticism of Morgenthau was he didn't look at soft power. He didn't look at the ideas that matter. And so, as Ed was saying, Chinese, a whole different philosophy towards governance, understanding of human rights, understanding of democracy, and freedom of expression, all these things. And so that's layered on to a very complex world where not only is the U.S. the largest economy in the world and China number 2, we also have dramatically different systems, and Russia has a dramatically different system. And they are not in alignment whatsoever. They're in violent opposition. Well, hopefully not violent, but certainly violent in Ukraine, because I do think Ukraine is a bit of a proxy for, we can get into Putin's motives, but I'm convinced Putin is interested in Ukrainian territory. He's also interested in extinguishing any chance that Russia would ever adopt the kind of values and about democracy, freedom. So it's a complicated world, and I'll leave it at that.
Good, thank you. So I'll begin with you know, the question of what motivates Putin, and of course we don't exactly know, but the big point I would make is that you know, European geopolitics is at the most perilous state it's been in many decades, including at least the last half of the Cold War, and maybe going back to 1945 when World War II ended, that's the last time we've seen, you know, this kind of violence in Europe. And since World War II, even at the height of the Cold War, there was something that everybody more or less agreed to, which is we're not going to resolve this with tanks and soldiers because we've seen where that leads, and it's not good. And we're not going to change borders by force. We're going to argue about them. We're going to have standoffs. We're going to point missiles at each other, but we're not doing this by force. And that's gone now. One of the really big questions I think that then shapes European geopolitics for the coming years is what Russia's objectives are. And I want to say Russia's objectives because I'm not one of those who's convinced that when Putin dies, Russia suddenly becomes a Jeffersonian democracy and a peaceful neighbor to everybody. You know, we thought he wanted influence in Ukraine. Okay, so we got to push back against that, or okay. And then he seized Crimea in 2014, and we thought, okay, he wants Crimea. We get it. We don't like it, but we get it. Then he attacked eastern Ukraine in 2014, and we thought, wow, that kind of surprised us. We didn't see that coming, but now he says he's got to have all of Ukraine. And of course, this launched this massive violent battle. And not only that he's got to get all of Ukraine, but he wants to extinguish the entire notion of Ukrainian nationhood. And of course, he's also intervened in Georgia and Moldova. We tend not to talk much about Moldova, but if you want to get a sense of Russians' aspirations, go read something about Russia and Moldova since the early 90s. And so on and so forth. And of course, now there's talk about we're going to overturn the entire Russian liberal order. And the most, I shouldn't say the most recent, but you know, last summer he talked about restoring Russia to its imperial boundaries, which, go look at that map. You didn't have the map of Russia in 1914, but it includes Warsaw, right? And Finland. And so we don't know exactly where he would stop. I think there's a good case to be made, not only for Putin himself, but throughout the last 500 years of Russian history, that Russia's western border tends to be located wherever it runs into something that it can't conquer. And it's actually ebbed and flowed over the years. I should just point out Russia's western border, or the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, has never been fixed for about more than 50 years in a stretch. The period from 1946 till 1991 is basically the longest period in history that Russia's western border has stayed in the same place. So that's what we have to look forward to. The implication being, to connect back with perhaps Morgenthau, is that I expect European geopolitics in the future is going to look a lot more like it did in the past, which is insecurity is going to be the norm, rather than us taking security for granted as we did for several decades. I think the interesting questions, just to maybe wind up, are does European unity in the face of this last, or does it not last? I think the United States has a huge role to play there. If Russia can vanquish Ukraine, where does it go next? If Russia can't vanquish Ukraine, where does it go next? And we'll see. So I'll stop there. Super optimistic, in other words.
All right. Well, to inject a little bit of American domestic politics into this discussion of foreign policy, last year, soon after the Russian invasion, J.D. Vance, the soon-to-be U.S. Senator from Ohio, said, quote, "I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or the other." More recently, Florida governor and Republican presidential hopeful, this is me saying it, not him, I'll leave it there. Ron DeSantis said that while the U.S. has many vital national interests, becoming further entangled in the territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. So as a bit of personal background, I was born in 1981 with Ronald Reagan at the helm. So for me, hearing comments like this coming from Republicans is notable given the traditionally sort of internationalist approach of the Republican Party to U.S. foreign policy. So here I have two questions. First, what are the U.S. interests in making sure that Ukraine prevails in this conflict? And second, what's the source of skepticism towards supporting Ukraine, particularly amongst Republicans?
I'll start by discussing the national interest. And going back to the balance of power and how we define power, economic power, territory, so forth, access to strategic trade routes and so forth, Ukraine probably isn't at the top of the list. But what I would argue is that Ukraine is extremely important if we're going to defend a world order that, Paul, to your point, that honors territorial integrity, the rule of law, those critical values. And right now we're seeing a situation where China doesn't want any respect for territorial integrity or the rule of law. They've got a dispute with Taiwan. They would love to see that norm be chipped away. And in fact, as I mentioned soft power, Chinese diplomacy has been driven for the last 50 years in terms of, maybe not 50, but certainly the last 20 years, undermining the U.S. leadership in the world order. And that is the world order that Richard Nixon very much was part of fighting for, that emerged out of World War II, which confirmed, again, that we don't change borders by fighting and that there is certain principles at stake. And so that's the big U.S. interest. I think the U.S. also has a humanitarian interest that when we see a leader of a country indiscriminately bombing civilians, killing, the amount of suffering in Ukraine is just beyond belief. You see these pictures of children and hospitals being, it's absolute savage, brutal attack by Russia against the Ukrainian people. I think that matters. Now, we have that going all over the world. I think we have to be honest, we have those kind of aggressions. But when you have it coupled with the violation of territorial integrity, and listen, that is a bit of an abstract concept. It is not, again, going back to land and economic power. But I do think as the world leader of an international order that has served us very well since World War II, and even before, the notion of state sovereignty predates World War II, but we've been the leader in the last 90 years in terms of enforcing and strengthening and otherwise encouraging that order. We have a strong interest, and that is more of a principled concept. It's more of an abstract concept. Ukraine isn't attacking us, so it's a little harder sometimes for people to understand and appreciate those principles, but I'd say those are very much on the line.
Well, I actually thought Congressman Royce answered this question fairly well in his remarks, in his discussion about the origins of World War II. History doesn't repeat itself. I think it was Mark Twain or some other famous person, right, said, but it rhymes. And this looks too much like that. Let me begin by putting this in perspective. In the first year of the war, the United States spent $46 billion in military aid on support for Ukraine. It's about 5.5% of the Defense Department budget. There's been some other aid as well, but the biggest chunk has been $46 billion from the Defense Department budget. it's a little itty-bitty part of the Defense Department budget, 5.5%, to push back against what is one of the two biggest threats the United States faces. I'd call that a bargain, actually. I think we're actually getting not only good value for money, incredible value for money. The biggest thing, the biggest cost that comes in a situation like this is the dying. And the Ukrainians are remarkably eager to do the dying if we'll supply the hardware. And frankly, I think they're going to remain dedicated to doing the dying, whether we supply the hardware or not. So what's in it for us besides actually a bargain in terms of defense spending? One of the things that I think is important that hasn't been mentioned often enough is a simple principle that says you honor your agreements. All right? Well, what agreements am I talking about? This is one of the problems, the bigger problems that, and just another cliche is if you don't know history, in 1994, the United States and Russia joined together to pressure Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. And the Ukrainians said, is this really a good idea? Look at what's next door. And basically, the US and Russia threatened, we're going to drive you into economic disaster if you don't agree to give up your nuclear weapons. And the Ukrainians said, well, what about our security? The United States and Russia and the United Kingdom signed a document in December of 1994 called the Budapest Memorandum that said, we will all respect and guarantee your territorial integrity and sovereignty. So Russia's invasion, first in 2014 and again in 2022, shattered that commitment. Now, we've got the international law expert here. The way that agreement was written, I don't think we would say the United States is legally obligated, not that international law controls what states do, but probably not legally obligated to help, but the question of moral obligation is there, as well as what do future agreements, commitments from the United States look like if you violate the ones that are really important, that are actually written on paper. And in particular, what does the future of nuclear non-proliferation look like if Ukraine is the example of how it works? So there's some ethical issues there, and there's some real big what happens down the road issues. There's also the broader issue of doing what's right. We have a powerful autocracy attacking a weaker democracy. Remarkable, to get to the beginning of your question, remarkable that the party of Nixon and Reagan is now, it seems, led by people who think that doesn't matter. But that's how this country has changed, and we have to recognize that. It's an interesting idea, right? Isolationism has a very long and broad history in this country, going back again to the 1930s, but also before. The folks call themselves realists and say we should not be involved in Ukraine. Is it realistic to think that we can let the world sort of collapse around us and that it won't affect life in the United States as we know it? That the Russians are not going to try then to further interfere in our politics and so on and so forth. To me, that's not realism. It's naivete. So the crux of the debate comes down to U.S. security in the narrow sense. And so let me try to say this. You can tell how I feel. But let me try to just be analytical, which is the bigger threat? Is the bigger threat that somehow we accidentally get drawn into putting troops in Ukraine? Right? What's the threat of that happening versus the threat that somewhere down the road after Russia defeats Ukraine, we end up having to put a lot more troops into Europe, spend a lot more money on defense, and actually maybe put troops in harm's way as we did during World War II, because the alternative is Russia just continuing further and further west. Reasonable people can debate that. I'll just tell you, I think it's pretty easy to keep troops out of Ukraine. In contrast to other wars, again, the Ukrainian shortage is not in people willing to die. It's in hardware. Somewhere down the road, right, after Ukraine, we'll have to face something else. And I'll just say, lastly, it's interesting. I'll stop there. That's probably the best thing to do. Source of skepticism among Republicans. Back to Nixon and Reagan. I mean, this is a big change. But that is one of the changes it's not just the Republican Party, but mostly in the Republican Party, is people are a lot more comfortable with authoritarianism than they were 30 or 40 years ago. There are prominent people in the Republican Party who speak very favorably about Vladimir Putin. And we're pretty, let's just say, not worried about the fact that he seemed to be helping him trying to win elections. Those are hard realities, and I don't want to get too partisan, but those are the issues that the country faces.
We'll have a little debate on this. Listen, I think I agree with most everything you say, and I absolutely support the policies you're advocating. I would suggest the number of pro-Putin Republicans is a distinct minority. I think they get a lot of attention. Again, having said I support assisting Ukraine, I'm not bothered by DeSantis's comment. We're a democracy. I want more debate. I don't think we've had enough debate about Ukraine, frankly. And I think the risks of escalation are real. Listen, we just had a drone incident with Russia. We've got President Xi going to Moscow next week. And also the unpredictability of war. We had the experts saying that Russia was going to be in Kyiv in a month last March. Look how spectacularly wrong they've been. So I think anytime we're discussing war, we need to be a hell of a lot more attentive to the details. The American people are not there, I don't think. The polling shows that. And so I don't agree with the DeSantis comment, but I want him out there. I want him talking. I want the other candidates, and we have other Republican candidates who are much more supportive of the traditional position. DeSantis and Trump get all the attention. But having worked in Congress for over 20 years, we cannot debate these issues enough. And Congress needs to take its responsibility. We're not taking the debate seriously enough, I don't think. I'm not sure the institution, frankly, is capable of doing a better job. And I'll just close by noting one, I think, positive development. I don't know if you've seen in the news lately, but the Senate moved to revoke the AUMFs from Iraq and Afghanistan. So we still had AUMFs, which this term, authorization to use the military force. Basically, it's Congress's stamp of approval for the Iraq and the Afghanistan war. And those things have been out there for 20 plus years for no reason other than Congress didn't want to act. And to me, having a little more congressional activity, a little more debate amongst folks, again, when you have drones getting shot down by Russia, we shouldn't be intimidated, but we should also be pretty wide-eyed in terms of where this potentially could lead and whether the American people are prepared for that. Russia's a nuclear power, and he's a desperate man who will do anything to keep power. I think, Paul, I think he's motivated by land, but again, I also think he's motivated by destroying the idea that democracy ever has a chance in Russia. And the way he's using Russian troops as cannon fodder and the utter disdain for his own people, and frankly, my surprise at how conforming and non-protesting the Russian people have been, just seeing their sons, what is it, like 50,000 killed conservatively, and just seeing a dictator be able to put those kids into the cannon and shoot them out, really is worrying about where Russia is and where this could go. And so again, not to belabor the point, when we're dealing with a country like that, I want to be pretty cautious and pretty open to debate.
I just want to say I completely agree. And again, not to keep on going back to the fact that Congressman Royce covered everything in his remarks already. The leadership of this country, and especially people who share the view that I do, but I'll specifically be a little bit partisan, the Biden administration has not elaborated the case for what's at stake for the United States, I think, very effectively. It's tended to say, well, of course, this is a good idea, rather than laying it out. There has been no Periclean speech. There has been no Gettysburg Address. And so on that point, I completely agree that if to the extent we're going to support Ukraine, we have to understand why we're doing it and what's at stake. And so I agree with you.
All right. I guess we'll move over into, since you both raised issues regarding nuclear escalation, we'll move over into that discussion. And since we're in the Nixon Presidential Library and Museum, I decided that it would be a good idea to inject Richard Nixon into our discussion. In American foreign policy, Nixon is known for the so-called madman theory of wartime diplomacy, which is essentially the idea that you make your opponent think that you might actually be mad enough to use a nuclear weapon so that they will capitulate to your demands at a lower cost. To what extent is Putin using this kind of Nixonian approach to warfighting against us? Is he bluffing when he rattles the nuclear saber?
Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You call it the madman theory, but there's a whole massive literature in sort of the rational theory of deterrence and game theory that says it's actually very rational to pretend. And that was Nixon's point. We don't know, and so it is worrisome. I have to say, he's been spectacularly successful with this because it comes up again and again and again. And clearly, already, it's deterred the West and any number of things they might have done to support Ukraine. Most notably, ATACMS, weapons that could hit Russia or parts of Crimea, which would be valuable to the Ukrainians. The point I would simply make is that if we decide we're not willing to run some above zero risk of Russia's nuclear escalation, we should tell the Ukrainians tomorrow that we're throwing them under the bus and to make the best of it. There's no point in pushing this forward now and then sometime later decided we don't have the stomach for it. I personally think it would be irrational for Russia to use nuclear weapons, and we could get into what would they actually accomplish on the battlefield, and the answer is there's not a good, you listen to the military folks, and yeah, they've been wrong about a lot, but they're not always wrong about everything. Actually, the military gains of using nuclear weapons in this conflict are pretty hard to find. So it would have to be this sort of symbolic thing. We mentioned Xi going to Moscow, right? What's Xi going to say to Putin about using nuclear weapons in Ukraine? So I'm not so worried about it, but I do think it is a risk that to some extent you have to run if you're going to bring this conflict to an end without capitulating.
I don't disagree. I guess I would question, though, he's used it well. Nothing seems to have gone well for Putin militarily in Ukraine for the last year or so. I know RAND came out with a study recently that said that they saw escalation of nuclear weapons as a possibility. And so to your point, Paul, I don't think we can completely rule it out, so-called tactical nuclear weapons. The world's been awful fortunate. We've only seen the use of nuclear weapons once in war. We've had American General LeMay calling for nuclear weapons in Vietnam. I'm sure there are Russian generals calling for nuclear weapons in Ukraine today, and that certainly need to just, again, to your point, factor into the calculus. Again, I agree it shouldn't deter us from what we're doing, but it should be given consideration. I assume the Pentagon is thinking about all these options. The other final point I would make, I mean, the RAND study makes the point that when you have a conventional, with the Russian military decimated, with a loss of tanks and armor and personnel, you do get in a situation where his options, the conventional options, shrink, and when that happens, then potentially it could lead to a tactical nuclear weapon. People don't think about nuclear weapons so much more. I remember studying them in grad school in theories of escalation. You can tell us about the academic literature on that. I'm dated from that.
Well, I would just say briefly, there is an updated academic literature, and it has to do with the fact that new targeting technologies in some ways make a first strike more feasible than in the past. So you know, that's yeah, it's a concern. It's not an easy solution for Putin to go to, is what I would say. But all the academic stuff, I should just say, it's all hypothetical. It's all, you know, again, sort of rational choice analysis. And to your point, you know, we can't always count on people to be fully
And what
rational.
would a tactical strike look like?
So to get right down into the nasty reality of it is, so tactical nuclear weapons, you know, there's very different sizes from a couple of kilotons, you know, sort of roughly the Hiroshima size or even smaller, you know, and up. And so it might kill all the troops and disable all the tanks and electronics or especially killing all the troops in a 600-meter radius. right? So they're actually meant to be, they're designed to be locally, have a local effect. So you could, if some position is about to be overrun, you could use a tactical nuclear weapon to like take out the battalion that's doing that. That's one battalion in one place on the battlefield, right? And Russia invaded with something like 200 battalions. So the point is, one tactical nuclear weapon gets headlines all over the world, but it only changes one fairly small part of the battlefield. So if Russia's going to go nuclear in a way that's meant at winning the war, it's going to have to use tens of these, not one of them, right? Now, an alternative is you don't use them tactically, you use them strategically, and you vaporize the center of Kiev with a much bigger weapon. You could do that as well. Interestingly enough, right, one of the things I think we need to think about is not only with nuclear weapons, but even with conventional weapons, that very central part of Kiev where the government resides has not been bombed from the air with rockets yet. And I do wonder a little bit about what the Russian thinking on that is.
All right. Next question. How would you describe the current state of the war in Ukraine? How are the people in Ukraine, Russia, and Europe handling it? And where do you think that this is headed in the next 6 months to a year?
Well, I think we've all been hugely impressed by the Ukrainian people and their resolve and their willingness to suffer just unimaginable hardship and death and losing their sons and even daughters. The European response, I think, has been obviously very admirable too, both supporting Ukraine with arms and humanitarian assistance, but also welcoming a lot of Ukrainian refugees. As I said before, the Russian, I'm not a Russian expert, but I'm just always struck when I read an article about the Russian response to the war and how domestic opposition is virtually nil. A lot of the Russians have left Russia who object to the war, and I think in terms of long-term consequences, even a Russian victory is going to leave Russia a very, very weakened state with all its best people fleeing the country, and if you look at the demographics and just the economic forecasts, a Russian win. How do you define win? I think the only way Putin's defining the win is if Putin stays in power. So this whole 20 years ago, and kind of thinking back to what Ed said about hopes for China and evolving into democracy, and I remember we all had hopes for Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union and Boris Yeltsin, and we had elections, but this really makes you second and third think about the viability of democracy and rule of law, at least in the short term in Russia, given the repression that Putin's exercising, and it seems to be working. Everything I see is that domestically he's not under threat by any democracy movement. Maybe the next general or the head of the Wagner group will depose him, but in terms of some type of democratic uprising, I think that's ahistorical for Russia at this point.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I'll just add a little bit maybe more detail on opinion in Ukraine to make one point, which is we used to talk about pro-Russian sentiment in Ukraine. And pro-Russian sentiment in Ukraine was never about we want to secede and join Russia, right? Secessionist parties never got more than about 2% of the vote anywhere in Ukraine. Pro-Russian sentiment meant we want to have good trade relations with Russia. We want to be able to cross the border easily and without a visa. And we want to sort of have relations both with Russia and with the West. That sentiment is now gone in Ukraine. One of the major disasters that Putin has created for Russian policy is he has, after all these years of saying Ukraine and Russia are really one and the same people, there's not a single person in Ukraine now who believes that anymore. Now, Russians are Ukrainians' mortal enemies. Sort of the nationally defining factor of Ukrainians now is we're the people at war with Russia. And so in a strange sort of way, that actually, I think, is going to force Russia to be more aggressive and more brutal in this war, because it's no longer the case that when they take over some of these places, there's going to be a whole bunch of people eager to collaborate with them or willing to collaborate with them. They're going to, the repression, depopulation that will follow wherever Russia takes over is going to be substantial. And I think this has implications for not only what happens if Russia conquers Ukraine, but for Ukrainian-Russian relations for the next 100 years.
Okay, well, I have one last question, and then we can open it up for Q&A. Beyond Europe, how is the rest of the world viewing this conflict?
Good question.
It hasn't been encouraging. As the chairman said, we do a lot of work in Africa, and if you look at a lot of African countries, most of them voted to condemn the Russian aggression, but many didn't. And I think that reflects the power side of the equation. We talk about power and principle. Principle being we care about things like territorial integrity and not trying to conquer land by military invasion. Some countries care about those norms, others don't. And if you look at Africa, Russia has done a very good job cultivating relationships with non-democratic governments based on the power, based on also China as well, but payoffs and a lot of governments don't see these principles as not particularly relevant to what they're trying to achieve. And if they have a relationship with Russia that's beneficial in some way, or a relationship with China that's beneficial, that's going to supersede their concerns about the international system as we understand it, as we're trying to protect it. And so it's a real battle, and we see that again playing out in Africa, but really all over the world. And there's another reality is that a lot of African governments don't view, they got a lot of other problems. They've got development problems, they've got conflicts, and they haven't necessarily viewed the international system as well serving their interests. And again, the Chinese and Russian systematic attempts to manipulate and undermine U.S. interests, U.S. values through social media, through misinformation. We need to be engaged in the developing world, and we're not. We're certainly not in the way that China has been over the last 20 years with the Belt and Road Initiative that was mentioned earlier. We just need to work a whole lot harder if we're going to have countries view the conflict the way that we view it. So.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of people in a lot of different regions, and I've been talking to people in lots of different countries in lots of different parts of the world, who, in one way or another, think of the United States as an imperialist country, and we can get into the historical accuracy of that or whatever, but that's the reality of the sentiment, and we have to recognize that it's there whether we agree with it or not. It's also the case that a lot of leaders in a lot of those countries, and one of the reasons why they maybe think of us as imperialists is we say things like, man, maybe you shouldn't be so corrupt. And so, again, there's a greater level of comfort in some places with the kinds of questions the Russians and Chinese ask and don't ask, and the kinds of things they do and don't do, than there is with what the United States has been doing, especially post-Cold War, when we've put a lot more emphasis on whether the countries we supported were democratic. Right back in the good old days of the Cold War, there were some different ideas about that. One thing we haven't mentioned yet, but I think this actually connects attitudes around the world with a lot of the isolationism we see in this country right now, is it's 20 years this week or this month since the United States started the war in Iraq. And I think that's had an effect very much on U.S. Domestic attitude towards intervention overseas, and it's had a huge effect on attitudes around the world. It certainly has had a big effect in Russia. It's one of the things that Putin continues to talk about, is this idea of who are you to talk about international law, who are you to talk about respecting borders and so on. And so again, we don't have to agree with those interpretations of history, but I think we should recognize that those kinds of ideas shape a lot of thinking, again, I think both inside this country and elsewhere.
I agree. If I could just add, though, in terms of, I mentioned Africa, a lot of these relationships are built just with the government, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the attitudes of the African people. And so they do some pretty good polling of Africa, a company called Afrobarometer, and generally African sentiments still are very much pro-American. If you look at our the cultural affinities between the United States and African countries, they're so much stronger. And Marie, you were very much involved in fostering a lot of those relationships. But if you ask an African, you want to go to the U.S. or you want to go to China, or Russia, there's no question about that. And so we do have a lot of power, and a lot of the attitudes that we're seeing. And so, for example, South Africa, unfortunately, has gotten very close to Russia and China and did a recent joint military exercise with them. That is definitely a result of many decades of strong cultivation by those two governments of the African National Congress. Not the South African people, but a certain political party that was Marxist in its origins. And so I agree, but we just have to be cautious, I think, a little bit about whose opinions are being reflected. And again, to Ed's point, we need to do a better job at explaining American positions, and not just American positions, Western opinions. I mean, how can you not condemn an invasion that leads to the death and destruction and bombing and human suffering that Russia's unleashed? But we're not getting that message out particularly well. And so we have a lot more work to do with African publics and South American publics, but it takes a lot of effort, and frankly, we don't always value diplomacy in our country. We don't put enough effort into it. We need to be doing a lot more if we're going to expect the world to look at these conflicts through the prism we'd like them to look at it through.
I would just add, if we as a country embrace a new era of isolationism, all those things you just talked about are going to get worse, not better.
All right, well, in the time that we have left, go ahead and open it up for questions. Yes?
Do we really know how much the Russian people are really opposing Putin? Do we really know that?
I can talk to that.
The Russian people opposing Putin?
So there is polling in Russia. The leading polling center, the Levada Institute, has now been declared a foreign agent. They're also but they try to do good work despite the limitations on them. So for example, you can't ask people's attitude towards the war because it's not a war. It's a special military. You can't. So what you have to ask is what's the proxy the pollsters use is what's your attitude towards the Russian military, and they've tracked that. And basically, the Russian people, to the best, with all the caveats on are they going to tell the truth about how they feel? All the information we have says the vast majority of the Russian people are either sort of lukewarm or just keeping their heads down. There's a small contingent who are absolutely gung-ho about this war, and there are some that are against it who are either keeping their mouths shut or who've left the country. But even if you go to Georgia, where a lot of them have gone, I've seen people that have done a lot of interviews among the Russian emigres in Georgia. It's not clear that they left because they opposed the war. They left because they don't want to participate in it, right? It's not the same thing. I don't think there's any reasonable way we can count on the Russian people to stop this war.
Yep. Taking a look at political people in their regard of approach to warfare, one only needs to look at Wilson, Roosevelt, and Johnson to understand that often the campaign is away from war, but afterwards it becomes, as they become more educated or after the election, completely different. Secondly, Russia has a new generation warfare strategy that uses the strategy of escalate to de-escalate, to scare people away from rational
I'll address two aspects of that. And I couldn't agree with you more. The State Department needs to be empowered. It is not a key player at many of these discussions. All due respect, Maria, I don't know how you'd feel about that. But too often it is not, people think of the State Department, the diplomats, they're at the lead of policy issues of resolving conflicts or so forth. The DoD just has so many more resources, and the State Department has a lot of internal problems. It needs to be empowered. In terms of, I think your point's a very good one about the difference between war in Ukraine and war in Iraq and Afghanistan and the whole nation-building concept. I mean, we shouldn't fool ourselves. Ukraine has been destroyed, and it's going to take a lot of effort to rebuild, but that is different fundamentally. And to Paul's point about President Biden hasn't done a good job explaining what the stakes are, I think if he were to take that line of argument and start making that nuance, because you're right, there is just, people look back at Afghanistan and Iraq, and just that is driving some of the opposition to engaging in Ukraine. My gosh, we were at that for 20 years, and where did it lead? So I think that nuanced explanation about where Ukraine was and what it could be might help.
Yeah, I'll just respond to a different part of that because I agree with all of that. And I don't know enough about the interagency process and a congressional commission really to speak intelligently about that, so I apologize. But about response to the use of weapons of mass destruction. The United States actually, and NATO, but really the United States, has a lot of things it can do in response to Russian use of nuclear weapons. At the time this really got to be a big deal last fall when people were talking about it a lot, David Petraeus, the former general and director of Central Intelligence and now commentator on things, said, here's what we would do. And I always want, he said, look, we could use our weapons, our conventional weapons, to take out every ship in the Black Sea Fleet, right? To take out every Russian military unit in Ukraine. His point being, we got a ton of conventional hardware that we have not put on the table yet. Not only not giving it to the Ukrainians, but of course we have our own conventional forces. And I had wondered at the time, it's like, okay, he does not work for the US government at this point. I wondered whether that was a deliberate arm's length. Somebody in the United States government said to him, hey, why don't you go say this? I'm guessing not. But my point is, we actually have a lot of effective ways of deterring Russian nuclear first use. Oh, he wants to argue.
We had an established policy that we dissolved. When you have no policy, since Clausewitz, and we are Clausewitzian still, war is simply policy by other means. Without the government setting a policy, the enemy doesn't know what to expect from us, and we do not act deftly or quickly enough in response to dire threats. Take 9/11 as an example, or Pearl Harbor. So my point is, again, reforming the interagency so that it actually proposes options for the president to enable the president's decision-making and to allow Congress to do its job would be something that the Congress can do but may not know it can do because it's been so long since Goldwater-Nichols, no one is thinking that way. But that's the way to reform our whole approach to the four instruments I mentioned.
Hold on one second, I've got a mic. Hold on, who's first?
Just real quick questions. Can Ukraine win the war? How would that come about? And what would a post-war world look like?
Yeah. That's the problem, is it took 10 seconds to say those questions. It takes 6 days to answer them. Can it win? Depends on how we define win, and that's been a problem. The Ukrainians have a sense of what it means to win, but the United States does not. What was the second one? How? Yeah, I think the how is by defeating Russian troops in the field, right? And to get back to the first question, the big question is, do you define winning as regaining all of Ukraine's territory circa 2014 or 2022, or something else? But to connect the first question to the third, you could define a win for Ukraine as a post-war Ukraine that might not have the same territorial footprint, but has a high degree of security and prosperity going forward. So this has been sometimes called the South Korea scenario, right? Well, South Korea still is kind of in this rotten situation with North Korea, but guess what? It's a wealthy, prosperous, democratic society. That is going to require a big financial and security commitment on the part of NATO. And one of the things that, just to try to be brief, is there's a connection between what the Ukrainians will be willing to concede on the battlefield and what NATO is willing to promise Ukraine in terms of post-war security. The Ukrainians aren't going to give up territory unless they get security guarantees from the West, and they have to be better than the ones they got in 1994.
If I could just add, I don't see a scenario, any kind of diplomatic resolution of this conflict. I don't see Putin willing to play that game. I think it'd be very hard to see Ukraine. I see it more as a frozen conflict that we see in Georgia and elsewhere, where there's essentially an end to fighting, but there's no resolution of territory or any type of formal agreement. I don't know how I feel about extending defense guarantees to Ukraine. I don't think the American people are there. I think we need to have much more of a debate about that. I don't think Europe, the other NATO countries, would necessarily be eager to sign up on that. But I agree with you, it would be probably the best way to end this on good terms. But we had a debate about Georgia, and when the chairman was in Congress, a lot of members were calling for extending NATO to Georgia, and I think he expressed some concerns about that. I just think extending NATO to those countries, we have to look at we have to look at our national interest and what the American people are willing to do, and they're not willing to. My son's in the Marine Corps. He's in Okinawa right now. If we were in Europe, I could not support him going to Georgia to fight for Georgia. So we need those debates.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But if there's a post-war world in which the conflict is frozen but there's no real agreement, and the United States and NATO don't continue to arm and support Ukraine, Russia will rearm and just conquer Ukraine. I mean, I think it would be, you talk about being realistic, there's no way they're not going to.
We've got room for two more questions here. Thank you.
You know, so far, we have been talking about Russia and Ukraine. Mm-hmm. But let me give you another scenario based on the wonderful maps, the Congressman Royce presented this morning. If we go back to the 30s and the 40s, right, the Second World War, mm-hmm. It was a small country, landlocked, mm-hmm. Germany, mm-hmm. with not self-sufficient at all in materials like fuel, raw iron, and etc. Right? And we had Japan, that they considered to be a war superpower, which was not. Right? But now, what if it's Russia, China, and North Korea, most likely, right? And potentially India. What if they do get involved, and now we have to face similar war, right? But with different players, one. Second, after the Second World War, we expanded, and we became imperialists pretty much around the country, around the world. As Brandon, okay, I can tell you, coming from Mexico and dealing with students, I teach at UCLA and Loyola Marymount, right, global marketing and strategy. And I mean, that's the way we are looked at, even now, okay? At that time, we became imperialists because we were dictating, because we produced the products and we given the term, the money, through the IMF, after the Wilson, trade agreement. So if, okay, China replaces enough of the economic needs, right, for exports, because China has a big problem now, as you know. China doesn't have enough production capacity to satisfy both the domestic and the international demands for products and services. So if they say, the hell with the international part, except with the Asian, including Australia now, they can substitute all this. So should we also change, question number 2, should we change our branding approach for imperialists to what Congressman Royce said this morning, right? Econo, right? Sorry, my mind. Econo, global, Thank you. Eco, global, you know.
I think it's a very good point you make about branding. I'm not sure I agree that we've been an imperialist country. We've got countries all over. We've got countries all over the world asking us to have military relationships, whether it be Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Europe. The imperialist right now is Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, we could. There's a lot of different situations, right? The Ukrainians are begging us to come in. The Taiwanese are deeply interested in us being there and helping. Japanese and so on. So we need to distinguish what's imperialism and what's not imperialism. And to your point, the Russians, more than anybody right now, are going where they're not loved. And I'll just say one of the things I say to my friends around the world when they sort of complain about American hegemony is, well, okay, you don't like American hegemony, fair enough. How are you going to like Russian hegemony or Chinese hegemony? And they all give me this look like, oh, I haven't thought about that. Well, that's what's coming if somebody doesn't do something, and it won't be pretty.
Okay, we've got...
I know you're not advocating Chinese hegemony. Yeah.
We've got time for about 2 more questions. They need to be brief and questions.
Yes. Very brief question. Nixon played a long shot and, let China play a role in the Cold War process, which resulted in the dissolution of USSR. Now, Xi Jinping is going to Russia, Moscow, next week. What do you think of the role of Xi Jinping or China in terms of mediating this conflict, according to the media reports sometimes you see? Thank you.
I would love to see it. I'm much more interested in the conflict ending than I am in whatever concern the U.S. government might have about that little bit of increasing role for China. And in fact, I think one of the best things that could happen in the world is that China would come to see itself not as a disruptor, but as a solver of problems. If there's going to be hope for a not really nasty future, that would actually be a good thing.
Okay, this is a speed round. Hold on.
Quick question. Mr. Xi, you responded a few minutes ago about approximately 50,000 troops. Wall Street Journal reported that Russia's lost somewhere between 180 to 200,000 troops over the last 12 months. How accurate is that? And I guess based on everything that people are asking right now, my question is how rapidly, and you alluded to it a few minutes ago, how rapidly does the Russian government, are they capable of replenishing their military supply? From all appearances, it looks like we're fighting a proxy war here where basically we're allowing them to expend their resources. And does Russia approach a certain point where they can't come back from this and really be a viable superpower going forward? So what are your feelings on that?
No, you're right. The estimates on killed in action, what I've seen have varied quite considerably from 20,000 to 200,000. I think the head of British intelligence had quite a high figure there, maybe upwards of 200,000 killed and wounded. From what I read, see, I do think there is a possibility that the Russian military just exhausts itself, and I think that's in part why you're seeing them build relationships with Iran and North Korea and China to replenish the armory. I don't know what their industrial capacity is to build more tanks.
Yeah, on tanks in particular, it's going to take a long time. They've got to do a whole sort of defense reconversion project. In terms of soldiers, it's like this is where Russian public opinion matters. Because if you think about it, 200,000 dead, that's a lot of dead. But in the context of the Russian population, think about the kind of sacrifices they endured in World War II. 200,000 is 1%, right? But can they mobilize those people within the sort of political situation that they're trying to maintain? And this is where we see Putin actually being incredibly cautious, which is in trying to run this war without the average Russian having to really think about it. And so that's the limit right now, is not the actual number of bodies in Russia, but the government's willingness to do what it takes to mobilize them into the army and to deal with the consequences. And so in one sense, they'll be able to replenish the army once this ends, right? But in a political sense, continuing to do what they're doing is going to be very hard in terms of manpower. They're trying all sorts of, I want to say crazy, all sorts of very unconventional things to try to get more bodies into the battlefield.
Okay, we got a question here.
Do you think the main reason for this war, when Ukraine asked NATO to join them, do you think if Ukraine right now announced it will be neutral in this war between NATO and Russia, do you think this war will end?
Do I think if Ukraine would pledge its neutrality, the war would end? No. I have been one of those and written 200 pages about it. This war is not about Ukraine's relationship with NATO. It's not. And in fact, in the months before the war started and in the weeks after the war started, Zelensky sort of said publicly, maybe we have to give up on the idea of NATO membership. It had no effect on anything. That's a short version. Don't get me started.
I see two hands, one here and one in the back.
I think that NATO should promote the Catholics and the Pope to bring peace between Russia and Ukraine.
There we go.
Is that a question?
And the question is why is NATO not doing that?
I don't think there's a clear sense that the Roman Catholic Church has the resources or ability or even sufficient prestige to bring the two sides together. There's a substantial Catholic population in Ukraine. Russia's an almost exclusively Orthodox and Muslim country. So it's just not clear that the Pope has the political clout to get anybody to do anything. Nor does the Pope necessarily have the perception of neutrality to get both sides involved. So, you know, as Stalin famously said, I think it was Stalin, right? Yeah. How many divisions does the Pope have?
Okay.
So I think I don't need to introduce myself, but I will. My name is Lavanya Garg. I'm a Fullerton College student, community college student, by the way. Assuming that every single person in this room is an immigrant because Jamestown failed, what should we do considering the triple P of, not GDP, triple PPP of the countries involved in the war, which we call a war? What do we do diplomatically about the Eastern allies and leaders, including Prime Minister Modi, who are silent regarding what is happening between Russia and Ukraine? Should we make a move and get on a jet and talk to them? Or should we stay silent and let it happen like we did with World War I and II?
This goes to the point about just how different countries perceive the conflict, and I don't know that badgering will really have that much of an impact, to be honest. I don't know. For Prime Minister Modi to come to the U.S.?
No, for the U.S. to go to Prime Minister Modi. Sorry, for the U.S. to go to Prime Minister Modi as an invitation because the Secretary of State was going to go to China. Just saying.
Yeah, India has all kinds of its calculation. It is, and we have to recognize the chairman's work for 25 years in improving U.S. relations with India. It still can be a pretty frustrating experience in terms of Indian alignment. They still, I did read that they're one of the, and I guess this gets back to the point about the Russian military. Russian arms sales are way down the last couple of years. India has always been the biggest consumer of Russian military hardware, and that's shifting to the U.S. and others. So hopefully that was always put forth as one of the big reasons why India was somewhat pro-Russia because of the military relationship, and then obviously of China in the border conflict between India and China. So I'm always for more diplomacy and more interaction. Getting back to the point, I think absolutely more U.S. officials need to get to Africa, and I commend President Biden for announcing he's going to Africa this year, and hopefully these can be conversations. But again, it's the principle, and I don't know that you go and you convince India that integral principles on the line here in Ukraine, and they're going to change their tune. I wish that were so, but I think if it were, it already would have happened.
Yeah, I think we have to believe, right, that there are very senior people in the State Department talking to their colleagues in India. The State Department does its job pretty well, actually. It may not be at the point where anybody's ready for that invitation. India is a democracy, less so than it used to be, and Modi has a lot to do with that. But it has its own interests. Its biggest problem is Pakistan, and guess who sold tanks to Pakistan? Ukraine. So we can't expect India to not follow what it sees as its interests. It's in a tough neighborhood. It borders both Pakistan and China. And of course, there's its history as perceiving itself as an anti-imperialist state and so on. And Modi's perception of his domestic political interests. We can do hopefully a lot, and I hope we're trying really hard to bring India and the Indian government on board. But we can't, but they have their own interests, and we have to respect that and acknowledge that as well.
We had a small victory on the India front. After 500 days, we finally got a U.S. ambassador confirmed to India, fellow Californian. And so to the point of dysfunction, diplomatic dysfunction for the U.S., finally I think he was confirmed this week. And so.
We've got a question here.
It's been reported that Poland is going to send some MiG-29s to Ukraine. Do you see that as a significant challenge for the rest of NATO in terms of not giving more advanced weaponry to Ukraine? And how do you think Russia is going to view that?
The numbers so far are pretty small, but of course it's another sort of barrier breach. One of the things that I think the Ukrainians are frustrated with is they were asking for this in the spring and summer of 2022, right? And there was this enormous debate within NATO, and finally, and nobody could seem to manage to get it done. And now this week, Poland just says we're doing it. So it is, that line, that famous Churchill line about the United States, they always do the right thing once all the alternatives are exhausted. I think the Ukrainians feel that way about some of their NATO allies, but it does open up that, and I believe now one of the Baltic states said that they're going to send some as well. I forgot which country it was. Oh, Slovakia, not a Baltic state, sorry. It matters. Their powerful air power is crucial, especially in if there's going to be any Ukrainian counteroffensive, air power will be a huge part of that. The numbers are fairly small, and jet fighters get shot down when they actually, when you don't have total air supremacy. So we'll see. The Russians said we're going to shoot them down, and my guess is some of them will.
Dr. Traven, are we're kind of at the end. Is there a wrap-up you plan? A discussion of the panel, wrap up what they talked about?
I would just say I think it's been a great discussion. These are really tough issues, as I think all of the questions have indicated. It's to get back to what I said at the beginning, it's the most precarious time in European security, I would argue since 1939 or maybe since 1961, the last of the big Berlin crises. Who knows where this is going to go?
I would just get back to Ed Royce's presentation and his discussion of Taiwan. I don't think that really quite came out in our conversation here, but I think it's very important for us to think about China's perceptions of the Ukrainian conflict and how that impacts their calculus in terms of moving against Taiwan. That is the principle that I spoke of non-aggression and territorial integrity, and if that's fundamentally eroded in Ukraine, sends a very bad signal, I think, to Beijing.
All right. Let's give a hand to the panel.
All right, welcome to the Asia Pacific panel. Thank you for coming. I know it's a horrible time of the day. in terms of commute and St. Patrick's and the combination of both. But we're happy for you to be here, and I am blessed by having two great experts on the Asia Pacific, Dr. Xiaoyu Pu and Dr. Sean O'Neill. And we'll start by, well, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and to talk about their areas of expertise.
Well, thank you. My name is Sean O'Neill, and I was telling my colleagues here, I'm kind of a pseudo-academic because I'm only a visiting professor at GW for this year. My day job is as a Foreign Service officer, and it has been for over 20 years now. I'm a career member of the Senior Foreign Service. And what that means is I have an exceptionally short attention span. I change jobs every 2 or 3 years. I've served in about 8 countries entirely in the Indo-Pacific region. Most recently as Consul General, American Consul General in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and northern Thailand, but also in countries as far west as Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and then Taiwan, Hong Kong, Thailand, and Burma. The reason I'm here is of course, because of Chairman Ed Royce. And I'd like to just take a moment, first of all, to thank Alexei and to thank Xiaoyu for joining me on this panel. Thank Owen Holmes for helping to organize this and all your work. Tom Sheehy, who was my boss on the committee, and Ed Royce, who I learned a lot from Tom and Ed Royce, Chairman Royce. While I was a Foreign Affairs Fellow on Capitol Hill working for Chairman Royce's committee, and this was a program where the State Department detailed me over. And 5 days before I was supposed to go back to the State Department after my supposedly 1-year tour there, Chairman Royce and Tom came to me and said, hey, what are you doing for the next year? And I said, well, I'm supposed to be at my next assignment in 5 days. I think I'm busy. They're like, no, you're not. That's fine. We'll make a call. But I learned, quite a bit, and this ties into what I'd like to talk about. What I'll talk about today is I think what I learned both in the practice of diplomacy, but then in my time on the Hill working for Chairman Royce and Tom, was that it's not enough to just have a good idea. It's not enough to just think about policy and what you want. You have to turn that into reality. You have to understand the mechanisms that turn it into reality, whether it's in Congress or out in the field. And that's something that I learned on Capitol Hill and something I hope I've learned and applied in my 21 years in the Foreign Service. And that's what I will try to contribute to today's discussion. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Xiaoyu Pu. I'm a policy professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. It's my great pleasure and honor to join the discussion. My expertise, including international politics, international relations, especially U.S.-China relations, but I'm also a very optimistic person. So look at the topic and my attitude. There's contradictory, right? So nowadays talking about U.S.-China relations, how could anybody be optimistic? So unlike Sean, who is a real diplomat, and Mr. Royce, who is a very influential political leader in U.S. Congress, I'm just a professor academia. I have zero real policy influence. My way to maintain optimistic view is to lower my expectations, not really change the world. How could I lower my expectation? So my professor told me that international politics, there are 3 options: bad, worse, catastrophe. So my job is try to provide some proposal to avoid catastrophe and seek maintain a bad outcome. So I think I can do that.
All right. Okay, since we talk about...
Thanks for coming.
Since we talk about pessimists and optimists, allow me to remind you about a sad joke from circa 1969 Moscow at the time of a Sino-Soviet border clashes, right? And the joke asks for the differences between optimists and pessimists and pragmatists, and the answer is optimists study English, pessimists study Chinese, and pragmatists study how to use Kalashnikov guns. All right, but that's just a dark humor from another war from 1969. We're going to focus on Indo-Pacific region. we will eventually, of course, talk about China. I have a long list of questions. We'll run for about 40-some minutes, and then I'm going to open the floor to exchange with the audience. But before we start, before the first question, and maybe kind of building on this story of optimism versus pessimism, we tend to summon the spirit of President Nixon today, right, on a number of occasions. But let me emphasize the another aspect of President Nixon diplomacy, which is incredible pragmatism, right? Belief that efficient diplomacy can substitute for the lack of or decline of material power. Right, so this sort of spirit of realpolitik and pragmatism, I think, is something that we should keep in mind when we address a lot of those issues. Nixon is the person who, at the time of his visit of China in 1972, when he scribbles his notes, preparing to meet with Mao Zedong, right, he writes, "Treat him as an emperor, show deference." Right? He is willing to raise toasts with mouth high with the perpetrators of Cultural Revolution. Right? If you look at this footage, it's just remarkable. He recites Chairman Mao's poetry during his visit. Right? So just an illustration of how flexible and pragmatic the pursuit of efficient diplomacy can be. Right? And remember, this is early 1970s, this opening up relations with China, an attempt to play strategic triangle. This is the time when American relative power is in decline after defeat in Vietnam, or the coming defeat in Vietnam. This is the time when the Soviet Union, the biggest rival at the time, right, is popping champagne and celebrating victory. We won, right? And look what they managed to do, Nixon and Kissinger, through efficient diplomacy, by playing the strategic triangle, using relationship with China as a leverage against the Soviet Union. So just something, something which probably might be a good inspiration for some of our discussions. But let me start with the general question about the Indo-Pacific diplomacy, right, or American strategy towards Indo-Pacific. First of all, does the strategy exist? That's the first question. Is it coherent enough? Secondly, what are the major recent changes in this policy or strategy? How do those changes influence the practice of diplomacy, American diplomacy in the region? So big changes, recent changes, how do they influence diplomacy? And the record of successes and, what's the polite word, failures in Indo-Pacific. Can we start with?
Yeah, no, look, well, first of all, I mean, if I say the strategy doesn't exist, they're going to stop paying me on Monday. So the strategy most certainly does exist. I think, the follow-on question is obviously how effective is it? How well-tailored is it to the challenges that we face in the world? I think that's an open question, and it's one that this administration and every administration and Congress should continually examine, because the world changes, obviously. It always has. It changes maybe more quickly or more asymmetrically now than ever before. And so the idea that you can write a strategy on a piece of paper or many pieces of paper and have that be static for 4 or 5 or 6 years is not very realistic, I think. But yes, the strategy does exist, right? This administration has articulated it as advancing freedom, building connections, driving prosperity, bolstering security, building resilience to threats, which is, fairly broad enough, I think, that you can be fairly flexible in response to changes. It definitely has, in my view as a practitioner, changed the practice of diplomacy, and we're seeing some of those changes now in how the State Department and how the interagency operates throughout the Indo-Pacific and in response to China's global ambitions, or the PRC, I should say, the PRC's global ambitions. We can see that in some concrete ways. In December, the State Department announced the launch of what they're colloquially calling the China House, which is a major reorganization of how the United States approaches the PRC and the issues raised by PRC's ambitions around the world, rather than having a bilateral China desk that deals with bilateral relations, which is the traditional model that we've had for many years. There's now a China House, which attempts to bring under one roof an interagency team that covers both bilateral relations, multilateral relations, economics, security, technology, sort of all of the different issues, both geographic and functional, that are impacted by the PRC and by our Indo-Pacific strategy and Indo-Pacific objectives and interests. And you know, I would hope, I'll just end by saying I would hope that the U.S. government, both the political, the policymakers, as well as the practitioners like myself who carry out policy, never just kind of keep that strategy on the shelf and refer to it the way we used to refer to encyclopedias and you were doing your papers, right? You know, when I grew up and when I went to high school and college, I'm probably in the last generation, we didn't have the internet. I was the last generation before that was a thing where you Googled everything. And you would open up an encyclopedia, and that encyclopedia, depending on when your parents bought it, it could be, you know, 1 year old or 8 years old. And, you know, it's close enough, right? Close enough isn't good enough these days, right? And I think this strategy, we need to remain focused on its objectives, and its objectives, as I said, are things like freedom, prosperity, promoting our brand of toothpaste, which is freedom and prosperity and free choice, as opposed to the more autocratic brand of toothpaste that you see out there. But I would hope that we continue to flex and change with the times, not just in our specific policies, but in how we carry them out. And the China House, I think, is one example of us doing that.
All right.
Okay, so regarding U.S. strategy, I think the United States has always played a leading role in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific region since World War II. Initially, the U.S. role is both in the security domain and in economic domain, but in recent 2 or 3 decades, China's economic influence has increased in the region. Now we see, I think, in a sense that a lot of countries in this region, they rely upon the United States to provide security, but increasingly most of the countries in the region, China is their #1 trading partner. I think from U.S. side, the key challenge is overemphasize military security, but not emphasizing enough. At least, I mean, from an academic perspective, we see the region in terms of U.S. diplomacy, economic diplomacy is not enough regarding sort of maintaining U.S. influence in the region. Finally, I think since immediate after the end of the Cold War, a lot of leading international relations experts, they predict that we will see big conflicts in the region. But in contrast, 30 years later, we see the big conflict in Europe. But still, despite all the tension over Taiwan, South China Sea, the region still, we haven't seen like a direct interstate conflict, interstate war. So I think to some degree, both US and China and regional countries, I mean, people can find all kinds of problems of specific policy, but to some degree, there are important positive lessons in the region. I think people need to reflect rather than only see the sort of problem in this region. Yeah.
Cool. Let me just follow up with a question about the pivot. Are we delivering on pivot to Asia Pacific, something which Obama talked about, but it was more of a rhetorical thing, right? Are we finally doing it, or it's still sort of more of a figment of imagination?
Yeah, well, I think about this a lot, and I think sometimes we think of it as you know, is the U.S. government leading the pivot, or are the agencies of the U.S. government effectively pivoting to Asia? I think to some sense, I mean, the pivot is a reflection of what private industry and citizens were already focusing on many years ago. I mean, I think that, you know, in the 80s and 90s, people were, you know, businesses and industries were obviously shifting and trading more throughout the Indo-Pacific. I think citizens were looking at it. Diaspora communities in the United States, diverse diaspora communities, certainly were focused on it. I know Chairman Royce, you know, has been focused on the Indo-Pacific region for the entirety of his time in Congress. So to some extent, the articulation of the pivot is more, I think, a reflection of what was already happening. So in terms of whether the U.S. government is delivering on that, I think gets back to the first question, which is, are we allocating the resources and the time in the way it needs to be allocated to meet these challenges in the Indo-Pacific? And I would say, hopefully we are. I mean, and this will be me just speaking as a citizen. Probably the way you deliver on that is to not think of it exclusively as a geographic region. In other words, it's not like we're going to divide our resources 20% to Europe, 30% to Asia, 10% to Africa. You can't think of it that way. I don't think you ever should have thought of it that way, maybe, but we certainly can't think of it that way now. And to the extent we are thinking of this more in terms of global objectives of promoting our interests or promoting our values around the world, we will be engaging in the pivot, because the pivot is really another way of recognizing that, like, the Indo-Pacific is really, really important, and it's going to be really, really important for a long, long time, and we neglect it to our peril if we want to achieve these other objectives. But I'm still paid by the government, so let's hear from someone who can tell you what they really think.
No, more specifically, I'm asking about initiatives such as, I don't know, what it was called, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Right. Sounds great, but once you look at it, it's a piece of paper, because there's no trade liberalization or anything. And it sounds like a great initiative, but again, coming back to your point, it's sort of, it's not really impressive compared to what China is trying to achieve.
But let me clarify here. I think on the one hand, there are important limitations what the U.S. government can do in terms of promoting economic diplomacy, because, I mean, U.S. government is sort of divided, democracy. But on the other hand, I think we don't need to overestimate it, the weakness of the U.S. side, because the greatest strength of America is the societies, people, business, private sector, universities, soft power. So that means, despite, on the one hand, China can promote economic package in Southeast Asia, but if we evaluate in a more comprehensive way in the region, right? So U.S. power, including soft power, is not necessarily declining, because along all these private sectors, business, universities, decades of involvement in the region. I'm not downplaying the role of government, but I want to sort of, given the difference between U.S. and China, we should put that into perspective.
No, and I mean, I agree. Having been in government for over 20 years now, I mean, we do some things well, and we do other things not so well. And I think that, the private sector is much better at allocating resources. It's much better at figuring out where these things should go and how to pivot and how to be flexible. And that is absolutely the strength of the American free market system. It has been for a long time. And I think to the extent we, in government, facilitate that, allow that free market entrepreneurialism, right, and flexibility to flourish, we are doing our jobs. To the extent we try to supplant it and decide how we're going to, divide up the resources on behalf of private sector, it's not going to work. And I think as a diplomat, I see my role, and we heard about in the question and answer session with Chairman Royce, the expansion, this goal of expanding economic diplomacy and trade diplomacy. I would hope that that is geared towards creating level playing fields, opening markets, and then allowing American businesses to go in there, as opposed to negotiating on behalf of the United States and its economy and its trade as diplomats, because we're just not that good at that, frankly. We're good at the other stuff. We're not good at that.
All right, let me move to China. The prevailing wisdom seems to be here, at least in analysis in this country, is that China used to practice something that was close to the idea of peaceful rise of China in diplomacy for a while, since late 1990s, probably until 2008, 2009 or so. Financial crisis usually is used as a benchmark here. And then China dropped peaceful rise and went into the direction of whatever you call it, what is the name?
Wolf Warrior.
Wolf Warrior. Wolf Warrior. Right. If you haven't watched the movie, I don't recommend. But in any case, yes, Wolf Warrior diplomacy. My first question, is this really the case? Or is it just simplification of something more complex? The second question, if this is the case, if peaceful rise is sacrificed, or was sacrificed, why? It seemed to serve China so well. The idea that we're going to rise peacefully, we're going to be a constructive power, win-win situation for everyone, China is a source of opportunity. So what happened? And first of all, is this a true sort of representation of the situation? Peaceful rise, over.
Okay, so let me, your question is about like China's recent foreign policy, generated a lot of anxiety, criticism, pushback. So scholars, news media conceptualize either as China's so-called assertive diplomacy, or some people nowadays talking about wolf warrior diplomacy. All these, I think we can put into sort of broader perspective. Number one, I don't think China's peaceful rise strategy has ended. Despite, I think I got all the criticism, I think all these criticisms to some degree are legitimate and reasonable concerns. But on the other hand, I mean, why people think about China's peaceful rise has ended? I don't think it's ended. I mean, at least, remember, my expectation is very low compared with Putin. I mean, China, even Xi Jinping still, I mean, practice to some degree a peaceful rise strategy. I mean, despite, again, all these tensions over Taiwan, South China Sea, China has not fought another military conflict with neighboring countries for many decades. Actually, all the news focus on like South China Sea, Taiwan. People might know China has settled territorial disputes with most of its neighboring countries in the past 3 decades, peacefully. So I think that's we need to put into perspective. But on the other hand, I think China's foreign policy is becoming more assertive. That generated anxiety, of course, as in different parts of the world. I think there are several reasons. I would think number one is China's power has grown. So different from 1980s, 1990s, China is economic-wise, it's a global power. So it's even China wants to hide, it cannot be hide itself anymore on the global stage. So to some degree, I largely characterize China's assertiveness maybe into different categories. Some is more like assertiveness is about like unresolved dispute. That may be related to Taiwan, South China Sea. Other assertiveness sometimes even could be positive. In the old day, China is always hiding, like Deng Xiaoping emphasized low profile. But nowadays, Xi Jinping's foreign policy is more active. So this kind of assertiveness is not always bad. Think about if like global climate change, right? If we want to deal with global climate change, we want China to play a more active role. Otherwise, we cannot deal with these problems. Think about North Korean nuclear weapons, other issues. I mean, to some degree, we need to maybe differentiate different types of more active Chinese foreign policy role. So maybe put into sort of more nuanced context.
Yeah, look, I think when we speak about China's rise, I think there are it pays to think of it in a couple of different ways. I mean, first of all, to the extent we're talking about the rise of China relative to the United States, I mean, we should not necessarily be concerned about China becoming a more assertive or powerful country in and of itself. I think because that's not a zero-sum competition. What is a zero-sum competition is the very, very different values that we promote and the interests we have around the world and those of the Chinese Communist Party. I think that is a zero-sum difference, and that is a competition. And so you know, it is not a problem, in my view, for the United States or our partners or allies around the world, you know, for China to be more engaged in trade, obviously, China to be more engaged potentially in diplomacy, in multilateral diplomacy. That can be tremendously helpful. But to the extent they are doing so on the basis of the CCP's very authoritarian approaches, both domestically and around the world, and in many cases coercive approaches, as Chairman Royce discussed, that is a problem, that is a concern, and that I think is where the U.S. under multiple administrations now has made clear that we are going to stand up for our values, and we do not, you know, look, when I was Consul General in Chiang Mai, people used to ask us all the time, they'd come up to me and say, you know, Sean, are we, so, you know, tell us why we should choose Thai citizens and officials come up and say, tell us why we should choose the United States over China. Why should we choose America over China? And I'd say that's not a choice we're asking you to make. We're not asking anyone to choose the United States over China, but we want everyone to have a choice, right? And we don't think it's mutually exclusive. You can trade with us and trade with China, fine, but we don't want you to be coerced into only doing business with one partner or one country. And so, you know, when I hear the peaceful rise of China, I would hope that China continues, you know, or maybe goes back, whatever the term is, you know, to being a country on the rise, but a responsible global actor that, you know, abides by things like democracy and free markets and non-coercive trade and free trade, right? I think that's what's important to the United States, and that's the kind of rise of not just China, but of all countries around the world that we should hope to see.
Cool. Thank you. Well, building on a previous panel, the obvious question, what are the lessons of the Russian conflict in Ukraine, war in Ukraine, and Western response to this war for Beijing and also for Taiwan?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I'll start just, you know, if you look back, we talked about the rise, let's talk about the rise briefly of China's military, right? And I jotted down some statistics. I mean, the PRC has obviously expanded, the PLA has expanded both its amphibious capabilities, its naval capabilities, right? There's no secret of what they're doing in the South China Sea. We're looking at possibly China having 700 nuclear warheads by 2027, 1,000 by 2030, right? A much more diverse delivery mechanism, tactical all the way up to strategic. So China has been advancing its military. Now, getting back to the Ukraine question, if you look at where that kind of started, a lot of that started after the first Gulf War. And I'm not talking about the second. I'm under the first President Bush, the first Gulf War, when we expelled Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. That was when the PLA and the CCP, which controls the PLA, remember, they report to the CCP, not to the Chinese government, right? Looked at that and said, wow, the United States is way, way, way ahead of us in military technology and skill. We need to catch up, right? We have been exclusively focused on Taiwan and a couple of other regional things. We need to become much more of a global player. And so what that tells me about Ukraine and China and Taiwan is that all of these things are obviously connected. And when something happens in one place and sets a precedent, or people perceive it to be a precedent, it has very long-lasting implications, I think. And I agree with the last panel. I mean, how we proceed on, and what Tom said I think is spot on. Ukraine may not be at the top of our priorities just based on trade or strategic location or any of that, but the precedent that is being set there is hugely important, both in Europe, but also in places like the South China Sea and Taiwan, and potentially in the Middle East with respect to Iran and Saudi Arabia and other countries. And so I think, you know, getting that right and not allowing the wrong precedent to be set in the Ukraine and not allowing people to perceive the wrong lesson there is going to make a big difference in the future of the South China Sea and potentially cross-strait relations.
Okay, my response is that a lot of people in the news, in the narrative, talking about today's Ukraine, tomorrow's Taiwan. I think analytically, we might use some kind of that kind of analogy for analysis, but there are all kinds of limitations regarding that kind of analogy. So the correct lesson about Ukraine is not how to fight another war over Taiwan, it's how to avoid another war by all means, for all sides, for the whole world, just for the humanity, I think. The correct lesson is not to prepare and think about how to fight another war over Taiwan. It's for all sides, including Chinese people, including American people, of course, including people in Taiwan. Because the correct lesson from Ukraine is to vividly illustrate what the difference between a bad status quo and catastrophe war, right? So, I mean, the status quo over Taiwan is not comfortable for either side or all sides, but how to avoid the catastrophe. I think that's the correct lesson for both Beijing and Taipei.
Any specific measures that you can discuss? How to preserve peace, right, in the Taiwan Strait? What can the United States do? Because the United States is essentially, kicking the can down the road, right? Let's just preserve this ambiguity, strategic ambiguity. That's it. That's all that I see. Anything more creative than that you can come up with?
I think, a lot of people talking about like the United States policy over Taiwan Strait nowadays. People easily criticize all the weaknesses, problems, but in my opinion, if we think about 5 decades of U.S. policy over Taiwan, it has been pretty successful. Because there are huge political differences between Beijing and Taipei over their interpretation of the relationship, right? And the U.S. has a big role, and the United States policy has this kind of one China policy, but also provide some sort of security protection, ambiguous sort of there. So the U.S. has really played a sort of two roles. On the one hand, U.S. deter Beijing from using military force. But on the other hand, the effect of deterrence always have the other side of the story. That's called political assurance. So deterrence is not just about, we want to fight. Deterrence always told the other side, if you do that, we will fight. If you don't do that, we will reassure you. So I think the most important lesson over the 5 decades is exactly how to balance these two, right? Deterrence and reassurance. So I think that's need a very skillful diplomatic, political messages. The U.S. need to constantly do this sort of balance act in a very nuanced way, yeah.
I mean, miscalculation is obviously a major risk and concern, and to the extent we could be the U.S. and many of our partners and allies. I think to the extent we can help President Xi or Chairman Xi, understand what an utter disaster I think it would be for the PLA to try to forcibly take back Taiwan for the PRC, for China as a whole. I mean, I think it would be an utter disaster for him, for his government, his party, the people of China. And that's not like because we think it's bad. It's not just because we think it's bad. It's because it just would be bad. It's like saying, if you don't bring an umbrella and it's raining, you're going to get wet, right? I mean, I'm not going to be the one who necessarily gets you wet, but it's going to be bad. And the risk is a miscalculation. And just getting back to the original question, I think, what I see in Ukraine is just the potential for people reading all sorts of messages and lessons into that run contrary to our interests. And it would be a disaster for folks in power in the CCP, I think, in particular in the Chinese Communist Party, to read into Ukraine that somehow a forcible retaking or forcible action in Taiwan is somehow more acceptable or less risky now than it was 2 years ago, because it's not.
All right. Thank you. Another question which seems to, well, I think we touched upon it indirectly already. In the minds of the Chinese leadership, in your perception of what they think, is China's overall power in international system, is it peaking, meaning it will decline soon, or is it still, on the upward trajectory relative to the United States?
Okay, yeah. So
objectively and in the minds, so in the minds of Chinese leadership.
Yeah, I think nowadays, the so-called the rise of China discourse has been there for 3 or even longer time, decades. So, but nowadays Xi Jinping is often mentioned the term the rise of the East and the decline of the West, right? So but on the other hand, I see in reality is that the United States overall power is not declining. Nowadays the distribution of power increasingly is like from a unipolar system, U.S. is only superpower, to a sort of like a bipolar system. China is rising, but there's still a gap between China and the United States. But China and the United States together are more powerful than other countries. I think this is more sort of the current distribution of power in the international system. Whether Chinese power is peaked or not, I think it's debated nowadays. China has all kinds, on the one hand, all the problems, demographic, economic challenges, and all the tension with the United States, with Europe, might also pose a problem for China's economic growth. But on the other hand, the Chinese society is pretty much still very sort of resilient, in a sense that economic growth, not like 10%, 7%, but it's still more likely China can maintain like 5-6% GDP growth in the coming years. I think this kind of sort of China as a declining power, I think it's also a little bit exaggerated, in my opinion. So, but on the other hand, I think Chinese leaders, despite some of their propaganda talking about like the decline of the West, they understand the United States is a resilient power. They understand there's still a gap between U.S. and China, and I think they understand the West actually is still more powerful, even though China's power is rising. So that's my analysis. Yeah.
A question I have, and I'll ask this of Pulauscher, a genuine question that I have about Chinese leadership that I don't know is whether they think of themselves first as, PRC's leaders think of them first as leaders of the PRC or as CCP officials still. Because I think that's an important distinction. And the CCP obviously plays an enormously important role. Everyone of consequence in the PRC who holds an office of consequence, almost everyone holds it by virtue of their party position, not their government position. What do you think about, do you think they think of themselves first as CCP officials or as government officials?
Yeah. So what you describe is, I think the Chinese political system, in a sense that the Communist Party of China is not a conventional sort of ruling party like we understand in the Western democracy, right? We talk about like a ruling party control the Congress or executive branch. But the Chinese Communist Party of China is sort of a, how to say, they call leading party, in a sense that they lead in all sectors.
Right.
So in a sense that what you try to ask, I guess, about the foreign policy implications is that when Chinese foreign policy, Chinese leaders, they make decision, do they consider prioritize CCP, the party's interest versus the country's interest, right? So I think they have a sort of a hierarchical understanding of national security. So their national security sense is is the number one is region security. Number two is territory integrity. Number three is about global security. So put in another way, for Chinese leaders, their number one priority is to maintain Communist Party's rule in China. They are not trying to, at least at this moment, to rule the whole world. They have neither intention nor capability to do that. I think in their mind, how to maintain Communist Party's rule, that's their top priority.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so the old Tip O'Neill expression, right? All politics is local, and that's something we say. What is China thinking, or what is Xi thinking, or what is, you've got to remember the CCP, right? It's a political party. It's very different than the Republican or Democratic Party, but it's still a political party, and the leaders of China are chosen through that political party mechanism, right? Which is very different than choosing leaders through a sort of organic political mechanism, certainly in a democracy like the United States or even in more autocratic countries. And so, I think that we got to keep that in mind when talking about Chinese leadership, because I think, as my colleague said, yeah, they really, Chinese leaders are going to be concerned first with the stability of the regime, meaning the stability of the CCP, or the monopoly that the CCP has on power, and their position within the CCP, and gaining power and currying favor within the political party that holds all of the power in the PRC. And that's an enormous difference, and it's one that's sometimes lost. I know it's lost on me frequently. I have to remind myself of it, and many of my other colleagues, and I think many of us when we think of China. And when you think of it through that political lens, imagine if every time you had an election there was a new president of the United States, the armed forces of the United States took an oath of loyalty to his or her political party, right? It'd be pretty different. It'd be way different, right? People like to talk about, Trump this or Biden that. It's like, no. It'd be way, way, way different if they had to swear an oath to a political party, but that's exactly what happens in the PRC with the People's Liberation Army.
My last question, and then I'll ask you to make concluding remarks, and we're going to open it to the audience. Are we ready, United States and China, right? Are United States and China kind of prepared for really managing serious crisis? And we just had this balloon incident, which was more comical than anything else, but I'm talking about real crises, not Chinese science projects, but something real. We mentioned Taiwan, you mentioned East and Southeast China Seas, and China giving, let's imagine China giving lethal weapons to Russia. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but something like this. Are we ready? Because if we're not, there's a lot of talk about the spiral of escalation, right, occurring between China and the United States. So I think that's sort of a big question for the future. Are we prepared to manage the crisis?
Kirk Campbell in January, senior China official in the White House, former Assistant Secretary for Asia, he talked about maybe the need to focus on establishing better guardrails with the PRC in 2023. That's something that we haven't heard a lot about in all of the talk of the balloons and this and that, right? But if you think back in the height of the Cold War, and we are not in another Cold War, I think, hopefully not yet, or ever, but at the height of the Cold War, that was one of the achievements of the Cold War before we really got to détente and then before we got to the strategic arms limitation of those things, was establishing those guardrails, establishing that hotline, right? So to really reduce the chance of miscommunication, to reduce the chance of something like a science experiment gone wrong, as Alexei put it, sparking something that you didn't want. Or, there were even talks of, at one point, a meteor entered the atmosphere, and NORAD for a little while thought that might be a first strike by the Soviet Union. You want to really, really minimize the chances of that, particularly when the PRC is developing, and going to have 700, nuclear warheads and troops spread out around the world, and the guardrails are going to be important. I don't think we're there yet. Yeah, I mean, I really don't think that we have those guardrails in place. I think we're not, and we don't have the muscle memory. I mean, we've lost it since the Cold War because we just haven't been faced with that type of threat of really going off a cliff and having those consequences be that dire, right? And without that focus, we've kind of lost the muscle memory of like, hey, what do we do if this thing starts to spiral? Who do we call? Like, does the State Department and DOD...
What if they don't answer?
Yeah, and the White House Situation Room, do they have that book on the shelf? And what if they don't answer? And what if it's a vacation? What if it's Chinese New Year, right? All of these things you've got to... Seriously, right? Thanksgiving. Like, you got to think of this stuff. And we're not thinking of it, I don't think.
A dose of optimism, maybe?
Okay, yeah, I'm optimistic. So I think before Jack Sullivan and Kurt Campbell joined the Biden administration, they published a very good foreign affairs article. They proposed the idea of a competitive coexistence. I think that's a very good framework. So the framework try to propose that, number one, both Chinese and American society are very resilient. So these two great powers have to find a way to coexist with each other. Number two, the United States will compete with China because the United States will defend American values, American interests. But the United States also need to sort of maintain some kind of peaceful framework to coexist with China. I think the overall framework is very good. But unfortunately, in practice, there are all kinds of problems. Number one, what's the difference between competition and conflict, right? So on the one hand, we talk about, okay, try to avoid the conflict, but in real competition, sometimes the difference between conflict and competition is very difficult. Number two, I think both countries have all kinds of politics, domestic politics, that will pose the challenges to officials, to diplomats. Number three, because of the pandemic, I think in terms of communications, there are not enough sort of people-to-people in-person meetings, even between officials or among diplomats. I think that will limit some of the effective diplomacy. But hopefully, maybe the pandemic is gradually over and there's some kind of real diplomacy will resume. So hopefully, the two sides can have some sort of framework to try to work out some framework that will manage all the problems. And by the way, I mean, U.S.-China always have all kinds of disputes, problems. Even in the 1990s, people nowadays talk about 1990s, U.S.-China, all the very friendly years. But in those days, there are all kinds of diplomatic crises as well. So I think we need to be cautious, but not too pessimistic, I would say.
Good. Concluding remarks?
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, what I'll say is this. I mean, not specific to the U.S. and the PRC or even the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I think something that I have tried to keep in mind that I've seen in my career as a diplomat, I was an attorney before, but something I've certainly seen as my career as a diplomat, is the importance of always trying to distinguish between intent and consequence, right? And we focus a lot of the time on what does the other party want to do, right? Or what do we want to do? And I saw this on Capitol Hill as well. I think one of the reasons why Chairman Royce was so successful in passing so many pieces of bipartisan legislation, advancing things, it's not just this intent of wanting to reach across the aisle or wanting to get the thing done. What the chairman focused on and what good legislators and politicians focus on is how do I get it done? What's the consequence? How do I avoid unintended consequences, right? And part of this in the practice of diplomacy, I think, and in negotiation, I teach a negotiation course right now, and I saw this as an attorney, as a capital markets attorney, I saw it on Capitol Hill, I've seen it as a diplomat, is related to this, the importance of distinguishing between your positions and your interests, and your counterparty's positions and interests, right? Your position is what you say you want. Your position is, I have 300 fewer nuclear warheads, or this, that's your position. I want to pay $3,000 a month in rent for this house, or whatever, right? Your interest is what what you're really after, right? And that could be intangibles, that could be respect, right? That could be, you know, I learned about Zheng He's, naval fleet, and I read about the Opium Wars, and we have been disrespected by the world, and we want some of that back, right? That can be an interest, a core interest. The position, it'll manifest as a position in some other way, but understanding that core interest and understanding how to turn the sort of the good intent that hopefully there's some sliver of good intent that we all share out there, which is like peaceful world and, you know, maybe not Putin, but, you know, some others. In turning that into consequence is quite important. And I'm, to end on an optimistic note, I'm very optimistic that if we get that practice of diplomacy and statecraft right, both domestically and overseas, look, we're in a position to have a remarkably peaceful, prosperous world. We do have a remarkably peaceful, prosperous world. We have the ability, and I think the potential to expand that for generations in an unheard of way in history. So that's what I hope we can all kind of go out and take away from this and do in the future.
So some final thoughts. I think number one is that for a lot of international political problems, it have all the complicated causes. So sometimes we need to differentiate between ideal goal and the most possible reality. Here we are at President Nixon's library. Remember, when Nixon visited China, he had to make difficult trade-offs between ideal and a reality, right? So when we think about a lot of problems, it's not necessarily ideal goals could always lead to ideal outcome. So sometimes for political leaders, for governments, they have to manage all these challenges. Their choices, as I described earlier, bad, worse, catastrophe. So the real goal is how to avoid catastrophe. Number two, I want to emphasize that despite sort of all the political, ideological problems worldwide, I think the best way to promote democracy is to make democracy work at home. So especially, including for the United States, right? So for U.S., the whole world, including U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific region, they see the United States as a country as a whole. So in a sense that democracy promotion is not necessarily about like criticizing Putin or criticizing Xi Jinping. It's also about how to make democracy work at home. That's very important, I think. So in a sense that I'm still optimistic about the U.S. because I think even we think about the government, sometimes all the problem, but American society is amazing. So I have lived in the U.S. for 20 years. I enjoy my work and my life here. I think in terms of like all the society, the civil rights group, universities, private sectors, all fantastic. So in a sense that we don't sort of overestimate this kind of American decline narrative. So we need to think about the U.S. position in the world in a more comprehensive way. So, yeah.
Great. We're going to open it to the
Yeah,
audience.
we've got some questions here.
Yes, I have my doubts about China, PRC, invading Taiwan kinetically. Okay, I have my doubts because they see what's going on in Ukraine, Putin. But will they try to subvert Taiwan cyber warfare, economic, political, disinformation? Do you think they will someday?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's evidence that certainly is possible, or maybe, you know, likely, or even has happened, right? I think that's an arrow in the quiver, right? If you're the PRC, that is certainly an arrow in the quiver. And, you know, the thing that gets you is rarely the thing that you were planning on, right? So they built the Maginot Line, you know, thinking of World War I, and Hitler flew over it because he had these things called airplanes, and he drove around it with his Panzer tanks, and right? So, you know, what's our Maginot Line? Well, maybe it's thinking that if you're gonna retake Taiwan coercively, it would be by, you know, staging an amphibious landing, and maybe you know, maybe we ought to be thinking of other things. I think the lesson, the takeaway should be the same, that either would be disastrous, either would be bad for the people of China, either of those approaches would be bad for the world, and certainly for the people of Taiwan. And I think the United States can be and should be quite clear that we would have a real problem with that.
So my response regarding the Taiwan question, I think there's no doubt Xi Jinping wants to take Taiwan back. That's even in China's PRC's constitution. Right. That's their sort of a PRC identity. Right. So, but on the other hand, the real question is when and how. So between the Putin-style occupation of war and doing nothing, there are Xi Jinping has tens of other diplomatic, economic, you talk about cyber and all the, so the real issues between a war, another war, and doing nothing. There are a lot of things Beijing can do. So the choices, what I want to emphasize from U.S. is not just talk about, deterrence. Deterrence is one of the equations. I still think in terms of political reassurance, diplomacy, even some kind of political dialogue between Beijing and Taipei, that's also very important because Taiwan has 100 billion trade plus with mainland China. So in a sense that over the Taiwan Strait, their economic, societal relations are very strong. So I think we need to keep the sort of peace and prosperity over Taiwan Strait and including East Asia. I think that's also very important.
Oh, thank you. This has just been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much. I'd like to go back to Alexei's question early on about the peaceful rise of China. After 2001, when China entered the WTO, things were moving along well. Everything was moving smoothly until Xi Jinping started these aggressive actions. Some of the things that Chairman Royce talked about over lunch in the South China Sea, the aggressiveness against countries in the region, this wolf warrior diplomacy that you mentioned. But in response, what China has now seen is Japan changing its defense strategy. We're seeing this AUKUS, submarines going around the area. The U.S. is trying to increase troops and basing in the region. We're seeing South Korea thinking about hosting nuclear weapons. So I'm wondering, have we seen any response back, counter response back from China to say, ooh, maybe we should have been a little more thoughtful about this, or have we seen any response at all? Thank you.
One small correction. It started under Hu Jintao. It intensified under Xi Jinping, but Hu Jintao is the person associated with the beginning of this, if I'm not mistaken. So, I'm sorry, please.
I think to some degree, in China, I have seen some kind of debates or discussion, reflection about, I think there are different opinions about like China's sort of assertive foreign policy. Some scholars even talking about whether China is a little bit like overreached sort of diplomatically. So there are some sort of reflections. But on the other hand, in international politics, it's pretty natural a country become more powerful. They want to expand their influence regionally and globally. But on the other hand, international politics also talk about balance of power. When a country is rapidly rising, there's always counterbalance. So in a sense that to some degree, Japan, South Korea, even Philippines, they want to strengthen their security relationship with the United States. That's natural reaction to China's more assertive role. But on the other hand, in the long term, I think for the U.S. foreign policy, there is still a question. U.S. long-term goal have two choices. Number one, should the United States maintain primacy in Asia, preventing China to maintain any role in the region, or U.S. goal is to maintain balance of power, preventing China from achieving primacy. There's a difference there. I think the second is more achievable. If the United States goal is to totally exclude China in the region, that will, I think, generate some sort of counter-effective as well. So counterproductive effect as well. So I think how U.S. think about the long-term regional goal is also very important. Yeah.
With respect to your question of whether the leadership or there are those in the PRC who are rethinking things, I would say, how would we know? How would we ever know that? I mean, you would know that in the U.S. through the presidential debates and through debates in Congress and by watching Fox News and CNN and MSNBC, right, at conferences like this. How would we ever know that if that's going on within the CCP? It might be. It's certainly, I'm sure the CCP is a big organization, right? I'm sure there are people who are having second thoughts or think that Xi's approach is not the greatest or maybe has some unintended consequences, but we'd never hear about it. And that's a major weakness, I think, of the communist system, of the CCP's approach, and that is a major risk factor for us, is that those voices are not going to be heard until maybe much later.
But can I have a...
Yeah.
As a scholar, I write a book, articles about the Chinese foreign policy. So I conduct field work in China, interview the Chinese officials and scholars. I think we can empirically actually observe some very nuanced debate in China, in the sense that, of course, Chinese scholars, experts in China's think tank, they cannot openly say, oh, Xi Jinping, President Xi is wrong. But they would, right, that would be too dangerous. But they will actually still write some sort of analytic articles talking about, okay, there's a BRI is right, but the implementation, there's all the problems. So they will not say BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, by the way, the Xi Jinping's major initiative. The Chinese scholars, they will not say, oh, BRI is wrong, because that means Xi Jinping is wrong. So they will say, the implementation of BRI has all the problems, generate all the backlashes. We can still observe some nuanced debate in China. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. But it's never going to come in the form of like the DeSantis response, letter where he's like, I don't think this is a court. I mean, that's a very clear statement.
That would be dangerous in China.
Yeah, that would be real dangerous, right? You get to say that once, and
Yeah, very briefly, two questions. Number one is the solution to Taiwan. I read a social media post in Chinese saying that what about dropping Chinese passports in Taiwan and give them $500,000 Chinese dollars for everyone who claimed that there's Chinese citizen. How would you react? What would the United States react to that? So that would be a social media proposal for the China-Taiwan unification. Another one is, do you think G2 is possible, given the rivalry going on, and eventually, is there a possible G2? Because that was proposed by Obama when he was the president, and China rejected it.
Look, on the first question, I mean, shoot, that would be pretty interesting to see. Airdropping Chinese passports and cash. I mean, I lived in Taiwan for a year, and they're exceptionally polite, people who live there. I don't know, if you drop cash out of an airplane, you might test that a little bit. No, I mean, all I'd say is whatever the proposal is, I think that, again, it gets back to this thing of you don't have to choose one thing or another, but we do want you to have a choice. We do want people to have a free choice. And so, there are lots of people from Taiwan who choose to go and move to the mainland and do business there and live there. That's great. That's their choice. If they are doing so freely, that's absolutely their choice. There's cross-strait marriages, there's cross-strait families, right, both from before and after. And so I think that's perfectly fine, right, and consistent with our values. As far as the G2, I'm going to dodge that question because I just frankly I don't. It's too hard to predict. Short answer is yeah, sure, anything's possible. And look at stuff that we didn't think was possible that's happening now, that we didn't think wasn't even on our radar a few years ago. So look, my mother is Japanese. She was born in Tokyo before the war. My father was born in Brooklyn before the war. My mother's house was destroyed in the firebombing of Tokyo. And as a young woman, she moved to New York to study fashion and married a young Irish guy from Brooklyn, and had me. And so I think that would have been inconceivable if you had asked her family when their house was in smoldering ruins after American firebombing, hey, do you think your daughter's going to marry a guy from Brooklyn and live in... No, probably that was, inconceivable. So certainly not, I would say.
So I think regarding Taiwan, I think all kind of creative solutions are welcome. I think as long as they can help maintain peace and prosperity. I think for average people across the Taiwan Strait, they don't want war. I think that's the minimum common sense, despite sometimes nationalist voices on the social media, especially in mainland China, sometimes sounds very hawkish. But if you ask average people, do people really want war? I don't think so. I think it's not in China's interest, in nobody's interest. I think the key is how to maintain the status quo and maybe wait for in the future when like the two sides have a better conditions, they might then have a more creative space to resolve their disputes. Regarding G2, I think China, in terms of distribution of power, I mentioned earlier, the international system might move to that kind of a bipolar system, right? U.S. is still the most powerful nation, China is number 2. But I don't think the G2 is possible because of a lot of reasons. China does not want to be seen as another superpower. That means all kinds of responsibilities, right? So China sometimes wants to still hide. And I think regional countries, India, Japan, they don't like the idea of G2 because that means they are not important, right? So I think that for all other reasons as well.
Okay, yeah, just quickly on that point. I mean, I remember I flew into Shanghai once, and I took the maglev, right? And it's the fastest maglev train, and you know there's maglev, and you go into Shanghai, and it's this gleaming modern city, right? And I had a meeting with some like a government think tank, and one of the talking points is we are still a developing nation. We're just a poor developing nation. We can't be held to the same standards. I'm like, I just rode the fastest train on the planet.
My book is right about that.
You have to divide everything by 1.4.
I have to remind us we're in the lightning round, so it means quick questions and answers, okay?
To those of you who do not know me, I was born and raised until the age 16 in Afghanistan, and I am from the same tribe as the Taliban. In fact, in the Helmand province of the Taliban, our family has got over 7,000 acres of land, which is all drugs. Now, Congressman Royce has given me the opportunity to testify in Congress several times, before and after September 11. And in fact, in a congressional club meeting in which also Honorable Marie Royce was available, Congressman Royce said, if we had listened to Hassan Nouri, September 11 would not have happened. Now, we started the war against the Taliban after September 11. For 20 years, we sacrificed over 2,300 of our military people in Afghanistan, $2 trillion in Afghanistan, 4 presidents in America, and we gave Afghanistan back to the Taliban. Why did we do that?
I'll just very quickly say, I served in Afghanistan for 1 year. We lost a colleague there shortly after I left. It wasn't a close friend of mine, but it was somebody that I worked with. And of course, thousands of other young men and women. I have tried in my 21 years not to take policy and the consequences of policy personally. I took that very personally. I'll just tell you, watching that in August of last year, I took that very personally. I was very upset, and I know a lot of my colleagues who were as well. And I think the lesson I took away from it is again, this difference between intent and consequence. You can have a well-intentioned policy. You have to carry it out on the ground in a way that's going to work. You have to pay attention to how you carry it out, how you make it happen. And as a practitioner of diplomacy in the national security community, you know, I will do my best, and I want others to do their best to make sure stuff like that never happens as a result of us not carrying it out diligently on the ground. I'll let others talk to the policy, but that's how I felt about it.
Switching gears here just a little bit, addressing the issue of China and Tibet. Would you like to comment on the consequences China should suffer for the genocide in Tibet? And secondly, they have said that they're going to choose the next Dalai Lama. The current Dalai Lama is getting a little long in the tooth, and that choice is going to be coming up here rather suddenly. They want to choose him. They have a very unique way of doing it regarding reincarnation. So is the PRC going to adopt reincarnation as a government policy, or what do you think is going to happen there?
It's a complicated issue. I mean, Tibet is part of PRC, but on the hand, I think this is, I speak from a scholarly, not any political perspective, in a sense that Tibet is PRC. I think even U.S. government's position is not a doubt or challenge Tibet is part of PRC. It's challenge how PRC government handles some of the minority issues there. But on the other hand, even in my class, I openly discuss, frankly discuss issues of Xinjiang, Tibet in my East Asian politics class. I ask students to read a bunch of materials, understand different perspective. It's a challenge how different society manage minority tension, minority problem. We might complain or even criticize all these some of the government policies, but it's a challenge for many society, not just China. So in a sense that how to manage minority region, right? In many society, it's a big challenge, not just for China.
Yeah, I mean, just, look, they the Communist Party wants to choose the next Dalai Lama, good luck. Right? I mean, in Congress, you could have, there are 435 members in the House who, you could have members on opposite side who have never agreed on a single thing ever in their entire, time in Congress. They'd agree on that one. That's one, if you did a resolution on that, you'd get 435 co-sponsors pretty quickly. So it would be pretty tone deaf to do it. They might do it anyway, but it wouldn't work out politically or public perception-wise for sure.
Great panel. Quick question. Given the fact that in 1949 the Chinese Communist Party inaugurated a 100-year plan to become dominant, and they appear to be on a good track, that after our Gulf War, the analysis provided a few years later, the Chinese colonels in unrestricted warfare proposing 8 or so different types of warfare, and that now China has launched 3 types of warfare that are underway right now: psychological, political, and legal. Given the aspect of Sun Tzu, who says, first win the war, then begin fighting, defeat the enemy without fighting, the acme of skill, know your enemy, know yourself. Is your characterization that this is just a matter of can't we get along? Is it necessary maybe to move the needle a little more toward catastrophe, since we're over 50 years into that 100-year plan? Or are we fooling ourselves in the face of the fact that they're very good at deceiving, and we might need to adjust our education and our politics somewhat to become more aware of what they might be doing and how we might counter it in a more sophisticated way than just hoping we can get along?
Can I answer
this?
Please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think nowadays there are all kinds of books talking about China or CCP has all kinds of genius, great strategic design to overtake the United States as a global power. I always doubt that kind of narrative or book, because if we assume Chinese Communist Party leaders are so genius, how could they have the family planning policy try to prevent the Chinese family have more than 1 children 30 years ago? Now they don't have enough babies. They want to have Chinese family to have more babies. If they are genius to planning all this, how could they, so in a sense that I doubt, in a sense that the Chinese government really has this kind of genius plan. Because if you visit China, you might know local community, provincial government, they have all kinds of struggle. They have all kinds of the policy process is very fragmented. You know, Xi Jinping is in Beijing, he's in charge. I think the most realistic goal for Xi Jinping is for him to control China or maybe control Beijing. I don't think Xi Jinping can manage the whole world or replace the United States as a global leader. If he want to broker peace between Russia and Ukraine, good luck. But other than that, I don't think he has a realistic plan to replace the U.S. global leadership.
Just very quickly, I mean, I definitely would not characterize it as just an effort of trying to get along. And if I did, if I gave that impression, I apologize, because I do not think that's the problem set. To the extent that we are talking about a difference in ideology, and the Communist Party has a very different ideology than us, that is a zero-sum difference, and that is something where, understanding your history, understanding the context, understanding the abuses of communism in the 20th century is very, very important. And places like the Nixon Library do that, and I think that would be very important to achieving peace, is understanding these differences.
One last question here, and then Marie gets the last one.
Yeah, do you believe that it's in America's interest to form a NATO-style alliance with our Pacific allies, and if so, do you believe we should include Taiwan within it?
Well, we have some robust alliances throughout the Indo-Pacific. We don't have a NATO-style alliance. We have been treaty allies with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, Thailand, the Philippines for many years now. I don't think it's our choice whether or not that turns into a NATO-style alliance. Obviously, these are sovereign nations that would decide whether or not it's in their own interests to do that. I do think what's important is, an alliance and a partnership of countries that believe in the principles that I was talking about, in free choice and free trade, in free navigation of the seas. If you like that brand of toothpaste, partnering with us and our partners, I think, is a wise move and would facilitate, our goals. And then your second question is, it's still the policy of the U.S. I mean, the U.S. government, I'm certain you ask anyone, it's still the policy of the U.S. government that the one China policy is still intact. And so Taiwan being a member of an alliance like that would be inconsistent with that policy right now.
Okay.
Okay. I just wanted to make a comment because I just would recommend to everybody in this room to Google the word Uyghur camps. Yep. We haven't really talked about that, and Ed talked today about how do people treat their own people. Right now we've got millions of people in prisons. It's so easy for everybody to look it up, and you can see it. They're Muslims. They're being tortured. The last thing I did before I left the U.S. Department of State, during COVID, which wasn't easy to travel, I met with the ethnic Kazakhs and the Uyghurs in Almaty, Kazakhstan, who've been tortured and also have family members still in the camps, okay? They also take away their businesses. I had been to Israel around Hanukkah, and I remember, when you go to the museum, you hear about how we started to kind of hear about things happening with the Jews. We kind of knew things were happening, but people really didn't do a lot about it. And so when I came back to the U.S. Department of State, I said to myself, oh my goodness, this is happening now. This is something that I can do. And so we really started focusing on that, making a task force. So my question to you is, why don't we have more traction on this? This is horrific. All you have to do is see the pictures, meet with the people, and again, it's transparent. This is not all classified. You can see it. So my question is, what can we do about this? And I don't think that China is operating in a way that is, kind of equivalent to U.S. standard or even the world. So
not even close on that. Yeah. Look, I mean, the administration has described it as a crime against humanity. It's clear. There's all kinds of evidence, as Assistant Secretary Royce points out, of what's going on there. And I think, look, I'll just speak as a human. I mean, we should care about that as people because it's a crime against humanity. And we should care about it strategically because I think it is a significant structural weakness within China. I mean, I think doing this to your own people within your borders is a significant destabilizing thing. And that is not in anyone's interest in the world. So even if you did not care about humanity one iota, you would still have an interest in getting this to stop, because it ain't going to end well if it continues.
So what I want to emphasize is that human rights, I mean, here's a brief story. One of my former mentors, Professor Tom Christensen, he's America's leading expert of international relations and China, and he served in the Bush administration. He told me a story that when he served in the administration, and some people say, oh, China started to criticize American human rights problem. Professor Christensen responded that that's good. That means human rights is a universal concern, in a sense that it's not just America criticize China. It's also we need to think about human rights, a universal concern. No perfect society, right? So I think I really like Professor Christensen's approach, in a sense that frame this as a universal concern, and also that means we need to have real conversation with China. I mean, Chinese government, of course, they talk about they sometimes deny that, but they also talk about there's some terrorism, security. I mean, I have former PhD students coming from Xinjiang. He shared his experience in my classroom. He talked about violence, bombing. They are real. So in a sense, I think U.S. government officials talk to Chinese counterpart. They need to frame this as a universal concern, rather than this is U.S. criticize China. So I think it's first, human rights are a universal concern. Terrorism, security is a universal concern. Let's talk how to handle this in a proper way. So I think that's a good start to start the conversation, rather than, oh, this is a one way, only America should care about human rights. Chinese don't care about human rights. No, they should emphasize human rights should be universal concern, because that's written in UN Charter, right? So I think that's approach.
I guess we're officially out of time.
We are, and
So
let's give a hand to the moderator, the panelists. I really appreciate everybody who attended today and attended both panels. Both panels were outstanding. We appreciate our sponsors. This has been another successful international symposium named after Mr. Royce. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again next year.